It's Wednesday, August 3rd at 9:32. This is a meeting of the Mitigation Committee of DPW. Welcome. And, Candace is our newest committee member. Candace is a city council member and appointed by the mayor and council to serve on our board. That's part of the resolution creating this committee. I think the city would be on our board. I think it's going to be great because I think we'll talk about it a little bit today, even the need for that. So we're all present, including our general manager, assistant general manager. Any revisions or deletions from the agenda? Okay. Approval of minutes of July 6th. I have a few minor grammatical changes that I'll just move on to Sharon. It's nothing new. The only thing of, if any, merit is I thought at the end of our meeting, we agreed, or during our meeting, we agreed to use the 2050 year as a storm, sea level rise. And the minutes come out with 30-year term. We talked about that, but we agreed to go 2050. So that's one thing I'll change. And Sharon, I'll give you my corrections. I'll leave them on your desk.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I wondered, when there are minor changes, should we just send them to Sharon? I mean, my degree wasn't an underground degree, but it's not important. It was an undergraduate degree.
I saw that.
Yeah.
I thought that was novel.
Yeah.
So yeah, that'd be fine.
Yeah.
And then she'll have them off from all of us in the next meeting.
I'm always going to be the complicating factor here. So one, we talked about a number of things last time, a number of different sort of issues. We talked about a number of issues when we were touring the wastewater treatment plant. I guess I'm wondering if for different assets, if different timeframes need to be considered, or is 25, 30 years good for every asset that we might imagine? Stormwater infrastructure, how often are you updating stormwater infrastructure? Maybe electrical infrastructure works on a 25, 30-year time frame. So I have no idea the answer.
Expected life, is that what you're?
I guess
Yeah.
so, yeah. Well, expected, useful life, when can we count on it?
I think, wasn't that something that you were going to put together in terms of a spreadsheet with useful life and
So
Austin?
I'm more than happy to put something together of that detail. I don't know where I draw. It's even with the assets. We were talking like when we did our asset management program for water and wastewater. We stopped. We tried to stay at like parent level, because when you get into the child level, when it comes to assets, you go nuts and bolts. So from a depreciation aspect, we can look at it from that. That point.
We already do depreciation. We have an escrow account that every month, part of our revenues, we have all the major capital assets listed, all the major equipment stuff, and portion of our income as like I don't know, the truck might be 20-year, something like that, and something
Depends.
else might be 10.
2010.
Depending on that schedule, money is put in the escrow account to replace them. So we have those estimates.
And
But I think we get pretty
I wasn't really thinking about depreciation. I was thinking about
No, I was just pointing- I was just
when we
pointing
were
it
talking
out.
about the sea level rise committee, it's one thing to talk about housing stock. It's another thing to talk about stormwater pipes. It's another thing to talk about, electrical grid elements and so on, wastewater treatment plant. I just was thinking broadly. I didn't have any specific.
I think one of the things to think about is that, this is a flag in the sand. And it doesn't prevent us as the board from saying, if we were building a new wastewater treatment plant, that we would certainly design for outside of 2050, because it's a complete new asset. And we have the leeway as a board to do that. But to try to, preemptively figure out which ones would fall outside of that versus setting a stake 30 years in the future.
Right. And did we talk about curves? there are all sorts of different scenarios at 2050, at 2100 and so on. And I know when we talked in the Civil Rights Committee for Planning Commission, we chose the intermediate curve, I think primarily because council was comfortable with that intermediate curve. But when you have the kinds of assets that are at stake here, and depending on risk tolerance, you may want to be thinking about one of the higher curves that protects you.
Well, we're already
We
using,
already-
agreed last
Yeah.
meeting that we're going to use the high
Okay.
curve. the
Okay,
Worst case scenario. basically,
okay, all right. I'd
for
forgotten
everything
that.
we were doing.
Okay, sorry.
But I think it would get very complicated.
Mhm.
That's like, I don't know how we break it out, the various things. We're going to talk about primarily the assets right now. So we could take a look at the assets and see if that makes any sense to do. Maybe like the water tower, which is a long-term thing, and things like that. But I think trying to chop it up into pieces would probably make it pretty complicated to track.
Yeah, because I mean, even things like, a major pump, if you're not replacing the thingy that it's going into, is that asset is different than replacing the entire structure. And, one's a like for like replacement in situ. And then the other one would be, hey, we really do want to build for the future.
And again, as we go through this and identify the assets and, if it comes up, it might be reasonable for some things and not others, but let's look at
That's what I was thinking.
them. Again, we sent out a list of assets that we can think of. Does anybody have any additions or deletions from that? We can go down them, we got the metering station out on Savannah Road, which is a biggie. The substation down on Schley Avenue, where the power is distributed to us, I mean, it's to our districts. We have the aerial wiring, transformers, pad mounted transformers, electric meters, with the wastewater system, the treatment plant, of course, pumping stations, lift stations, grinders, force mains, manholes, sanitary sewer piping. I put on, I don't know if it's on yours or not, but I put clean outs later. Most likely. Yeah, be careful about those.
Outfall piping probably would be included in
Oh.
the treatment plant.
Of course. Water utility assets, the wells, the treatment plant, the water tower. Hopefully we'll have towers by 2050, hopefully. Hydrants, meters, outside faucets, water meters. I put outside faucets there because they're typically low, and we could have backflow if we're not careful with those. If you have conditioning at the residence, you can get backflow into the house. So
Is there a way of setting up any backflow type requirement on those kinds of things?
well, we're doing that for irrigation. That's a requirement.
It's coming.
Yeah.
In the next month or two, it's being pushed down from the federal government to the state and the state to us.
But that's
Actually, the International Building Code, the IBC, requires that you have vacuum breakers, and they don't have check valves in it, actually. It's a vacuum
Yeah,
breaker. on the hose
all
beds.
your new outside faucets and stuff come with a anti-siphon vacuum breaker type device on them. The older ones don't, of course, but the newer ones do.
But it's been
There's
around,
plenty of those.
but it's been in the code
Oh, yeah.
since
It's been a while.
at least the 2000
Yeah.
code, maybe, or.
Can you help me
Irrigation,
understand what this means? Because I'm missing a
What's
key
that?
piece on the outside faucet question of backflow.
if your outside faucet, even though it's not part of the DPW's issues, that's a homeowner's issue. But they're typically down low, and if they're going to be flooded, and for some reason, rather than, there could be a suction back into the house. in
So if the
certain
water level
conditions.
rose to the point where it got to the faucet, that's,
Yeah,
okay,
it could
thank you.
flow
I'm good
back
now.
in,
I'm good now.
And
I
move
was-
through the south, through the system and contaminate not only the house, the system itself.
I'm good.
And
Thanks.
as I said,
Okay.
they are requiring for sprinklers, which they never did before, backflow preventers. And
Oh, so
that's
sprinklers.
retroactive. retroactive too, isn't it?
So if you've got
Even
a
if
sprinkler
the pipe is
system,
under pressure, does that make a
Yeah.
difference?
Well, there can be a case where you could have a backflow, back
Okay.
pressure on a pipe for some reason.
so then you're looking at irrigation systems as well as outside faucets.
Yeah.
So they're connected in that regard. Okay,
So
thank you.
That might be good to have that on there.
the outside hose bibs are one thing, but what about basements? Because those, there is no vacuum breaker or any other requirement on.
What do you need?
So you're saying like all the
Well, I have
domestic piping.
My
that we
laundry
do down
room
in
is
the
in the
laundry-
basement. So my
Right.
faucets connect
But-
2 feet below grade.
Isn't that all supposed to be above?
In
Building code?
in floodplain, the newer ones, again, the older ones, there's some that have, and down on the beach that have first floors that are below, they have basements down at the beach.
There are garages under some of the houses on Bay Avenue with all sorts of goodies down there.
Because they were grandfathered in before the ordinance was in place, so.
The first house I built didn't have a basement, but had a first like, a garage underneath. And they've redone it. They put washer and dryer down there in the flood zone.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I was just thinking from the completeness perspective there.
Yeah.
In any case, there'd have to be a negative pressure in the water system
Somewhere.
itself for it to draw.
yeah,
Well, yeah, you're assuming that the water system stays intact during the storm event. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
so I'm sorry, you got to re-plumb your house because.
Well, I'm just put great big loops in.
Because I'll take care of it. Okay.
Actually, I'll have the little lady move the laundry upstairs.
Stormwater utility assets,
Oh,
catch basins, storm sewers, swales and ditches. Some of them are BPW, some are conservation, some of them are core requirements, retention ponds, and tide gates. Anything else that we should add to this?
Well,
list?
under electrical for it to be complete, I mean, because you got aerial wiring and power poles. What about the underground utilities?
Sure.
Somebody was just asking why we weren't undergrounding everything in the city. I'm assuming there's a standard response to that. You talked about some of it last time. Besides cost.
That's the main thing.
Yeah.
But it's costing the floodplains, keeping the transformers elevated.
And that's, I was thinking about that back yesterday, looking at my transformer. Now, it's been raised. So I've got a pad now. It's been raised. My elevation is 4.2. It's been raised 18 inches, but nowhere near flood elevation. So what is the requirement for a pad mounted transformer? Is there any elevation requirement?
Well, we put, I believe they're like 2-foot pads down there, but I just want to provide an example when we're talking
Go
about
ahead.
when you're building this is the one I showed you.
Oh, yeah.
No,
Building in the
Yeah.
floodplain, I passed this. My bearings. This is down in Bishopville.
You live all the way down there?
No, I live in Ocean View, but I passed this. My wife works for the city of Ocean City. And then we board horses down in Snow Hill. So we usually go the back roads all the way home or all the way down there. See if I can get my bearings. The IT system was quite nice today. Okay.
At Newark, Maryland. Is that what it's close to?
No.
No. There
So
it is.
that's an example of what had to be done for a pump station that's in the floodplain. So if you continue down this road, you'll be able to see, actually, these power poles sit in the water as you go down. But one of the discussion topics is, for example, down in California, California's wet well sits in the middle of the road. And that brand new house was built right there on the corner of California.
On
And
the
you can,
inside.
yeah, and you can see where the grade is of that house. Everything sheet flows down onto the road, and so that pump station lid cover is always flooded. Now that doesn't mean there's water being intruded. I mean, there's some, but that's a watertight seal vault. But if you had to get access to it, it's always underwater. But in return, if you wanted to rehab and build, your issue not necessarily is your wet well and what the wet well looks like, but then your control panel has to build to the floodplain. So the person in California, if you were to replace the electronics where it is now, and you put that in front of their house, what are they gonna say?
Right.
Oh, lovely.
Well, the alternative is you'd have to build, a watertight structure with a watertight door.
Do I recall correctly, that maintenance or troubleshooting of electrical problems when you're underground electrical wires is a real nettlesome
It's,
question for you all?
it's always, and I've talked to Red about this many of times. When you have to physically fix underground versus overhead, it's much easier for overhead. It's
That's
just,
what I was remembering.
you're able
Okay,
to
yeah.
see, you're able to identify when it's underground, you gotta do a little bit more
Because this
testing.
question came up when I was on the Board of Public Works in 2011, and we talked through that a bit.
Mhm.
So, yeah,
But the trade-off is that you get much less incidents
understood,
underground.
understood.
So it's a trade-off. of-
Understood.
Yeah.
But then the cost of doing the underground is how many times more cost?
Well, so I'll use Rehoboth as an example. So Rehoboth just did what, 2 blocks, 1 block, $26 million.
Oh,
That was the rehab project.
Yeah, yeah.
wait, that was to underground an aerial wire system?
Yeah, with you throw Comcast, Verizon, et cetera in there.
Okay.
You're-
But if you do it as part of your.
A
A new
Street
construction,
rehab,
that's
yes.
a whole different, or a rehab,
Right,
but
yeah,
yeah.
I mean, and
But-
that's where, I think we missed the boat back in.
Well, there are varying degrees
2000.
of cost, but
Yeah.
it is more expensive than the other. above
Oh,
ground,
yeah, it
by
is.
a factor of,
When we met with DP&L and we were talking about a second feed in, what did they give us a cost per mile on transmission?
Well, this is big stuff. though.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, that was transmission,
what was that, $1 million a mile?
more than that, I think.
Yeah.
But that's transmission line.
So
But you see, I mean, the article at Press Center, on this, more and more in the industry,
Mhm.
In susceptible areas.
Sure.
Florida,
Right.
Texas, Louisiana, they're doing it.
and if
so.
you were doing a blank slate, not a big deal, but if you're talking about retroactively inserting conduit down there, then you're talking about this kind of expense, are you not?
So then you go into it, yes, and then you get
Okay.
into a second issue, is that right now, the co-op has stopped all implementation of new services. It's basically you get on a list, and when it's your time, you'll get a new service. One of the reasons for that was supply chain issues. Well, if you look at the availability of transformers, pad mount transformers are multiple times harder to get instead of pole mount transformers. So I have a quote right here that I just received for pad mount transformers. You're talking a 50 kVA transformer is now $8,900. That same transformer was about $2,500, maybe a year or 2 years ago. The lead time on these transformers, and this is very good lead times, mind you, is 26 to 28 weeks with estimated final delivery is 34 weeks coming out of Mexico. It's the only, right now, this is the only transformer company that's putting transformers out at the same lead time as what they're giving you on a piece of paper.
But just to clarify, the $1 million a mile was transmission.
No, I
so-
understand.
So it's
I
like
understand.
6.9, 13.8.
But you could break out retroactively fitting underground utilities versus new development utilities versus high
Voltage.
voltage, yeah. But my point was, because I was trying to remember what I had learned back 10 years ago.
That probably was 10 years.
But yeah, so I just want to be sure I understood
Yeah.
the parameters of this. Okay, thanks.
But Austin, given that scenario, to the numbers you just gave, does that mean that you guys, I mean, I don't even know what the policy is for all new developments, particularly major subdivisions, are they all supposed to be undergrounded? Are we talking about relieving that requirement?
No, so we are a different entity, and there are several people that envy us, is that we put the burden on the developer to procure. They build to our spec, and so they turn everything over at the end, similar to water and wastewater and stormwater. So what we've done is essentially said, okay, you want to build a development, you guys are responsible for procuring the transformers, having the conduit installed, procuring the wire, they build it to our spec and they donate it to us. The interesting part is that puts everything on their time frame. So if supply chain's an issue, it's their issue. It's not necessarily our issue. Now we keep a healthy stock, and right now, for us, right now, we're comfortable. But this quote is essentially pre-planning for a year. that quoted 20 transformers is it's $193,000 for 20 transformers. And a development usually has between 13 and 20, depending on how many you have.
But I think a more direct answer.
Yeah.
All new developments have to have underground.
Right,
Okay,
that's what I,
that's
that's what I
what-
figured, and I'm just
And-
wondering if, given everything Austin just said, if at some point city is going to be approached or DPW is going to be approached to say, hey, guys, we gotta go aerial.
To-
Clock's ticking, the bank's asking for money, blah, 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 blah.
it hasn't come up as to build an entire development out as overhead. There's a discussion on putting one overhead at Lewis Waterfront Preserve to bring the models online, but they're still, so I got
Is that temporary?
temporary.
There you go, that's
One-
this is
one
exactly
pot
what
bag,
I was imagining was this kind of a discussion.
Yeah.
Hey, Bob.
Just one single pot bank to bring on 4 model units.
And,
Okay.
yeah, I was just down in Florida. In Florida, there was a development I drove through. They had poles sitting next to every pad with temporary cables going up and temporary cables coming down till they can get their transformers.
Mind you, that's one natural disaster away from not being 30 weeks for a delivery.
So
It's very precarious. I mean, nationwide.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how we got in this position, but it's crazy.
we outsourced all of our production.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as also said before, it's the same thing. That's the ideal situation of how everybody's running in order right now.
Yeah.
You have a disaster somewhere.
Yeah.
You,
Forget
where are they
about it.
taking them to? They're taking everything to that disaster area.
That actually occurred with that Texas storm last year.
Yes.
You couldn't get a transformer then at all.
It was the Texas storm and also
The tornadoes.
the tornadoes in the
Yeah.
Midwest
Okay.
and Missouri
That one really wiped out the,
supply chain. Because all you do is you have the federal government step in. Now, I'll also tell you is that on the same front, what the co-op, what the co-op's doing is they're going back to legislation and they're pushing for changing the legislation to essentially change the domestic production, basically changing the steel components so that the standard for the steel can be reduced per se to increase domestic production. It's either that or they change the tariffs.
And would that actually do it? Or is this just a way for the steel
Well-
manufacturers to, yeah, I don't know.
It's,
Yeah.
it's cheaper.
Yeah.
It's quicker, it has more domestic production. The transformers are less efficient. So
Mhm.
you're trading off
Oh, is it?
efficiency.
Fishing?
Yeah, the whole reason why the laminates in a transformer or motor, those thin steel plates they used to be called non-oriented grain silicone steel. And it creates eddy currents of magnetism inside them, which adds to heating. And so the new steel that is, and the Obama administration required that everything be upgraded. So it's called grain-oriented silicone steel. And you get much less of the induced magnetic currents, reduced heating, greater efficiency. 70% of all of that steel comes from Asia, China being a major component. Russia, the Ukraine account for 7%. There's only one domestic supplier of it left in this country. So it's a international problem, but more so in the US because all transformers have to be built to this higher standard. So what the industry is doing is they're kind of using the opportunistic effect for the long term to get rid of something that they didn't like to begin with. Now, in the short term, maybe it does. We could go to non-oriented steel a lot quicker, but sorry.
Lot going on. So now we have an idea of what we're trying to mitigate. And I guess the next step is, what is the primary, where are the primary issues in Lewis? And that's why we have the maps here. And we have a 2-year rise. And I think, did you print the 1 year out to just?
The 2 and the 3. Yeah, the 2 and the 3.
So this is mean higher high water plus 2 or 3 or whatever.
Yeah, the maps came from the vulnerability study that GMB did in 2016 for the city.
I sent you a copy of that study. All the attachments were there. These were the attachments. They were just too big to send it with the study that's in. But this is the what?
That's the 3 feet.
This is the 3 foot. Now, when we designed to this flood, say, what elevation would we have to design to with the freeboard requirements and so forth in the city's code?
Well, the city code has 18-inch freeboard right now.
Okay.
One of the recommendations that the resiliency committee came up with was talking about raising up a little higher. It wasn't part of the 2 that were approved, but they were talking about adding to the 18-inch. So they didn't say a number though.
What I'm trying to get to is if we're assuming a 2 foot rise by 2050, where would that be? Where would the elevation be to meet that criteria?
I know these numbers cold. Mean high water is 2.63 feet above NAV 88 as at the Lewis Breakwater Harbor.
Okay,
So
then you're
that's
talking
5 feet NAV 88, 5.63, or what did I say?
two,
I've got it.
two, something, two.
I've got the number in my phone, but whatever, yeah, so just add.
It's about 5 feet.
It's add 2.5 feet to 3, that's the elevation.
So we'd have to be 5 feet.
5.5 feet, I think, didn't I say 2.63?
Yeah.
So,
3
so,
feet would be, yeah.
so, and the other thing
Can you
that,
translate to freeboard for me? does that
okay,
mean?
so
What
then
would
you
the
add
freeboard
18
requirement be?
inches,
Then
so
you add
that's,
18
that's
So you're talking 36
another,
inches?
that's like
Freeboard?
That's like
Freeboard is
7
18
feet.
No, no, I
inches.
know, but if you elevated
It's
it
not the
to
88,
accommodate
7.
that,
It'll be 4.5 feet. 3 feet plus.
I want to throw another complicating factor in this, right? This is a map of sea level rise. This is
a map
like
of-
when
no,
the-
this is a flooding map.
Okay, because the other factor that I think we all need to keep in mind is the frequency at which we reach this
right,
elevation. And those numbers are predicted to go way up. Almost at least a 6x, if not a 10x factor.
Isn't that discussed in
Between now-
that West Cedar study?
Yes. Yeah.
In the West Cedar study, he talks about the frequency, what's
I
happening
think-
today is going to.
I think it says it's like 100 days a year.
Yeah.
Of
3 months.
nuisance flooding.
I mean, and that gets us, this is more a city issue. Are people still gonna be living there?
Right.
When does that happen? By 2050, are the people on the beach, particularly where I am on the lower side of Cedar, are they even gonna want to live there? Or be able to live there? So to be designing mitigation over there, or is it at some point, are they gonna be written off?
You're asking
But that's not, I think
really
it's-
important questions.
that's a city, that's not something that, well, I don't know if the city can even decide that. But
That's
is
a whole
is that the
community wide.
that the reality?
Well, the city's gonna hopefully do the West Cedar Street floodgates,
Yes.
which will make everybody feel good for about 10 or 12 or 15 or some years. So you'll be fine at a period of time.
And I won't be around after that
Okay,
anyway.
but back to your question.
That link
which
I
is
sent out.
Go under
how high
plan.
does the treatment plant have to be?
Under her.
Can we use a pencil and a calculator?
Well, right, so when we were doing the
Third one
tour, when
down.
we were doing the tour of the wastewater treatment plant, Austin mentioned that you actually now have a very recent elevation certificate for all the various elements we walked around and saw.
We have for some of them, not like the main building, we don't have it for, but we have it for the drying beds. We have elevations off the drying beds. We have flood cert for the headworks building from the process building, and then we have data points for the oxidation ditch itself.
So there's a way to take these data and basically overlay them with a series of points with elevations and sort of come up with a set of scenarios.
Okay, but Press's question was how much?
What do we have to build to? And what do we have to mitigate to, I guess?
Yeah.
Is the issue.
Well, okay,
And
so,
is it realistic? I mean, is it even something that's going to be livable? But again, that's a deeper question because that's more of the city's line. If we can build it that high, but is anybody going to be there to use it?
Well, it's gonna be very interesting when the city council takes up the executive committee recommendations.
Right.
And whether they're gonna push any further, because the executive committee recommendations do absolutely nothing for any of this.
Right.
And the consensus, I think, among the council people was that the two recommendations that were proffered for consideration are interesting, and we'll deal with those, one of which we've already pretty much said, when we take it up for a vote, we'll approve it, informing prospective buyers of the question that they need to know, not just for the property they're purchasing, but for egress, emergency egress. If you're going to talk about buying a property and you've not visited Lewis very often and you don't know that the major roadways flood, then you ought to know. There should be disclosure there. So that was kind of,
Well,
that was a
what's-
low bar. We jumped over it and said, yeah, that should be approved.
What's a disclosure say? I mean, does it go to 2050 or does it give a year?
It hasn't been written yet.
Yeah.
But,
Well, actually, as it was proffered,
right,
it points you to the direct to the websites. It doesn't do,
and I think there'll be
And which
more, I
is fine,
think there'll be
because-
more substance to that, but
Right.
nonetheless, there will be some information that will be conveyed. And to the extent that prospective owners actually do their due diligence and go to those websites and read it, your chances of that happening are on a spectrum. But then the
and
other,
there was, and we just
the other-
realized, there was an honest debate because, putting more detail in means that it becomes onerous to update it because it changes every
Right.
3 years,
Right.
if not more frequently, versus going to a substantial
website
source.
where they are doing it automatically,
But then you got what Candace just said, which is,
Right.
and how many people are actually going to do that?
there's that. But as for the other concepts or constructs that were considered that weren't approved and proffered and forwarded to mayor and city council, the city council members all allowed that those should be looked at, not just dismissed because they weren't provided by the resiliency committee to mayor and city council for consideration. So they will be looked at.
Well, I guess the point is, how do we get to where mitigation we need to do? I mean, that's what the next thing, if we're going to be planning mitigation
so
facilities, what are we planning for?
I've never gone through this exercise before,
Mhm.
so I'm probably gonna throw a bunch of junk out
No,
here,
no.
but when you look at this array of assets, and you just look at, say, the wastewater system, you've got all these yellow dots that are
Yeah.
that are the manhole covers, you've got all the drains, you've got all the pipes and lift stations and all that. Is there a way that you can sort of grade those to say, we have one kind of a problem when a manhole is wet, when it shouldn't be wet. We have another kind of a problem when a pump station has intrusion of water. We have another problem when the drying beds, and so on and so on. And maybe that's what this study did. I didn't read it probably as carefully as I need to, but are there certain things that you can afford to continue to have flood and you can sort of deal with that? And then how many of them are you're actually having to rebuild something at a higher level or jack it
Well,
up? or
I
whatever?
think, I mean, obviously the water system is a pressure system. So you can get things tight, so nothing gets in, right? I mean, you could build a sewer system and pressure test it just the way you do a water system. And build structures and pumping stations and things like this to be watertight and seal all the manholes, be watertight. So theoretically, it's going to leak someplace, but for the most part.
We don't have that problem now. We don't have that issue now. We don't have that situation, I should say.
Where,
When you look at the monthly reports, for the meetings, when you look at the precipitation versus the flow, clearly there's intrusion somewhere in the system.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we still have clay pipe out there. It's 4 feet long with big connections buried underwater, under the water table. So, most of the stuff we're putting back in or new stuff is all PVC. It's tight for the most part. And you still have cracks in it. That's occasionally. I mean, you could, I think theoretically build a tight sewer system.
Still need to ventilate it, remember?
Well, yeah, but you got the house.
It's stack, you
Yeah.
gotta rely on the stacks to
rely-
make sure it's all clear for
Yeah.
that ventilation.
Or we could put like at a pumping station, we have a vent behind the control panel, which is gonna be up there anyway.
Right.
So you would have to vent it.
And we are using the not watertight, water resistant manhole covers now.
Well, most of them are the
Salad bowls.
Salad bowls are they're called. They're an insert. You can get watertight manhole covers too.
Mhm.
I mean, that are built to be underwater. But right now we have an insert that you put in there that.
And that's irrespective of which way the water comes from, whether it comes from the ground or above.
That's just from surface work running into it.
Okay, so,
Because, the manhole covers used to be vented with holes, and some of them still are.
right, Austin's nodding because he knows I've been harping on this groundwater problem for a while.
Well, we've talked about, I mean, we have it in there for lining older manholes that are brick manholes, either fixing them or lining them when they can be lined. There's a company that does like a pink liner and they go in and they line the entire manhole all the way down. Whenever we run into, what we do is on any project that we're working on, I'll give you an example, the railroad in Monroe project, we camera all the sewer lines to see what they look like. Even if sometimes you have terracotta sewer lines, if the terracotta is still in good shape, we'll line it. And we've had very good success with lining them. We'll line it, we'll go back, cut all the laterals out. So we look at it from a lot of different, perspectives, but the biggest thing is, I think being able to look at each pump station, and that's where you kind of get into the detailed SCADA system, because as it stands right now, we can look at it from a pump run time. You can't necessarily see it from a flow because we don't have flow meters on all of our pump stations. Some of the other pump stations, like our bigger ones, you see flow meters, but then it's hard to identify. I mean, so if pump station 4 after a heavy rain event, jumps by, 250,000 gallons a day, the issue you run into is that where is it coming from? So then you start stepping back, and
Gotta look
then,
all the way upstream.
and if you don't have flow meters, then you're running off a pump run time. So
So this is something else that I was thinking about. Looking through one of the other links that you had in the mail message you sent out. Most of these kinds of analyses are only looking at surface water overlying flooding related to sea level rise. They aren't accounting for this groundwater issue. And nobody's done that. But from everything we've learned from the Delaware Geological Survey over the last couple of years, low-lying areas in this environment are going to have to consider the concurrent groundwater, the rising groundwater level as a result of this water coming up.
Yeah, but it's like,
And my point is, it will start to make other spots get wet as well. This isn't all there is.
right, but with the new pipe and new construction, they pretty much are watertight,
Okay.
the sewers, because of the great connections they have now, the couplings on them, and the gaskets and so forth. They're pretty watertight, so that cuts down.
The other consideration is the effort that we're talking about goes to the property line. And the laterals from some of these older houses are, they're loving life, taking all the water that they take, and so the remedies have to go beyond the standard limit of the utilities,
But again,
usual purview. So I just, when you're talking about the repairs of sewer systems, it's a snake in the grass that you're running after for hours, where you get every last hole in the pipe. It can be rather extensive.
So what you're saying is it's sort of the cost of doing business in this area is we're gonna have intrusion.
Yeah, and as you point out, the higher the water level is. And then I also want to point out that the flooded water is going to be saline.
Mhm.
And if that water is getting into the sewer system, it heavily impacts the treatment system. So the
Well-
groundwater may not be as saline and may not be a problem in that regard, just flow is a problem.
Well, the interface changes as sea level rise.
Yes.
The other thing that these don't take into account is this is a bathtub model of sea level rise. This is not precipitation. This is not like the AECOM study, even as faulty as it was, that combining the two events.
There's all sorts
So-
of complications.
You know, a 10-inch rain cloud stalling over us will just exacerbate this. And that is not considered in anything. It was in the sea level rise committee, but it was completely struck. Everything else.
Again, theoretically, we can make this
And
thing
the flat.
pretty damn tight, if we upgrade our requirements. We're pretty tight now, but I think taking other things into consideration, new laterals are much better than the ones we put in years ago, obviously, so they're not leaking as much, but the historic ones, we're going to still do it until we replace. With all the replacements going on, a lot of that's taking place at the same time.
Well, Mark's point is a really important one. I'm wondering how you handle everything inside of the property boundary. Is that a simple, is that just sort of like a
Well, there
guidance
are-
document? How do we
The
help?
liner systems, usually, do you use that liner that goes up the lateral a little ways also?
Yeah, we basically go to the clean out
Yeah.
of property line.
Yeah, and it's not impossible to take that further into people's property, that sock that they blow into and line the lateral pipe. It's possible to take that further up the pipe onto private property, however, and help in sealing. Whether that nails it all, it's always a subject.
I guess that's something that they could put in the plumbing code or the building code, I guess. If you're renovating a house, to a certain degree, let's get this good, other higher standards, if they're over 50% or something, that they should also line the lateral. That's something that maybe it's not even thought of.
Current
That would slowly erode the problem, that's
Yeah.
for sure.
probably the current code, I'm trying to remember when you do your pressure test on the sewer portion of the house. You fill it with water and it has to stand for 8 hours, I think. And where is the plug put?
It's normally, it's not, sometimes it's outside the house, right outside the house. Sometimes it's under the house, right at where the laterals drop down and stuff,
I'm
but
trying to remember when I did mine.
like-
I can't remember where I put the plug.
it doesn't include
It does not include.
from the
lateral.
house to the, Yeah.
Maybe it should be to the clean out. That would be our responsibility to clean out, and the homeowner would have to have.
yeah, because that's the difference in the plumbing code. The plumbing code basically really references everything inside the house.
Yeah.
So that's where that kind of disconnect, because
Yeah.
again, we're coming to the clean out at the property line. And the plumbing code basically deals with everything inside the house. So it kind of like, there's
Sounds
a
like an
dead zone.
important no man's land.
Yeah, it
there.
sounds
kind
like
of,
something maybe should be upgraded.
Because it's like the plumbing inspectors. The plumbing inspectors, when they come do, they only check the house stuff.
Right.
They don't care what is out there in the yard.
Yeah, that's what I kind of remember, because I think I only went 2 feet with an inflatable
Yep.
plug down the
Yep.
line.
Correct.
And so the laterals were not checked.
Well, of course, under new construction, you guys do watch the lateral go in, I imagine. There's an
They do
Inspector,
an open trench inspection.
yeah. And, that's not necessarily a pressure test, but a pressure test could be added at that point pretty straightforwardly and wouldn't be, too much of a hassle for a developer or a contractor to do it at that point.
Well, if they're already doing it at the house,
Yeah.
as I'm saying, take it out to the clean out.
You do have a clean out at property lines in almost all cases in the town.
Almost all cases, if we do a project where they don't exist, we put them
Yeah.
in. So they're included in the project.
Property line or the easement?
Well, usually it's property line clean out right away, wherever you want to call that line, is what we do. But we have had instances where there's some properties that don't have clean outs. And in those instances, like on Town Road, if somebody didn't have one, we installed them and we coordinated with each property owner, say, okay, this is where we're gonna bring it in at, you know, where do you want it? And then
And
that's
I think my
And it's a
clean out-
benefit to the property owner because if there is a plug in any place, it's your problem if it's after the clean out and it's their problem.
Yeah.
So it's a good delineation.
Yeah, I think my clean outs is my.
that's usually where they're placed. I mean, as close to it as possible.
So let's get back to what elevation we're mitigating to by building code now. So if we have to have everything raised up, we're assuming 2 feet rise between now and 2050. How would that impact the city's code and what elevations we'd have to mitigate to?
You see the FEMA, you know, when you talk about doing the FEMA and the floodplain and all that stuff and the freeboard, it references the first floor level. So when you're talking something like transformers, you're not going to have a first floor level. When you're talking about pump stations, you know, you're going to have to, I don't know how much the freeboard would come into play in that. Do you just turn around and say, okay, we're going to go to the mean high water and 3 feet of sea level rise? You know, I don't know if freeboard would come as much into play as that.
Well, I think that should be covered someplace, because I said, I've walked out my driveway in flood where I've had floods of Sandy and then this going there to next January, knee deep, hung out of my garage.
Yeah.
And the pad mounted transformer before we lifted, is humming away as I'm walking past it. I'm wondering what's going
Go over
on.
and rubber boots.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Water and electricity.
Yeah.
That isn't it?
So, but isn't there should be a requirement for the height of
Yeah.
the pad mounted transformer too. People aren't gonna like it.
Well,
Correct. I mean, you could do that, but I'm not saying that you have to say, okay, you add freeboard in there. Maybe you just throw a number. Maybe you do a 3 foot instead of that freeboard, because freeboard more references something to do with the first floor level of a home.
So
You probably know this better. And I can't remember if it's in our flood code or if it's the FEMA recommendations. There's a phrase in there about critical infrastructure that requires, so I'm not even sure we're under the city code because critical infrastructure has got to be designed to a higher standard.
Yeah.
So, you know, we, in my opinion, unless our lawyers disagree, I think we can do anything more stringent.
See, that's what I was trying to get at. Yeah.
But to me, I mean, you know, again, I live in my own house. My electric panel has to be at elevation 9, I think, something like that.
Yes.
Could be a platform, I have a platform to stand on to get to it in the garage. But the transformer out in the yard,
Correct.
down, well, elevation 4 is the property, and it was tied up another 2 feet. So
Yeah.
it's 6 or something, and it's like 3 feet short of where I'm required to be in the house.
Yeah. See, because FEMA really is only concerned about structures, building, dwellings, things like that. So that's where they don't really lean towards and really address too much of when you're talking about your pad mount transformers and things like that. Or, you know, that's, yeah,
But going
they
forward,
stay away. They're more worried about the insurance portion of the home to ensure that.
But we're designed for mitigation 2050. Seems to me that new head mounted transformers will be a lot higher from somebody's front yard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
seeing we could do that.
Should be.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so can they ever get wet or must they always be dry?
well, they can't get above the lugs on the thing.
Yeah.
They're about
And
3/4 of the way up the transformer.
So you're gonna have to be,
But in theory, if you're talking on a sea level rise, and then you also have, when you have your high storm events, this is when you start to talk into process, right? At what point do you shut the water off? At what
Well,
point do you shut the
right,
sewer off?
right.
What time? At what point do you shut the electric?
That's just what I was
off?
thinking was,
Yeah.
that, I'm not the engineer that many of you are around the table. It seems to me, in some cases, you could have a switch. I'm using it in a general way, where
Yeah.
you're basically saying, okay, we're gonna knock out all those load transformers that we know
Then you can.
okay.
Put a float switch in there or something.
All right.
No, but seriously, you
Take it out of your
can
toilet.
basically
Seems
have
like-
a localized floodplain-based blackout while the waters are high. I mean, it's far from palatable, but it may very well be a shorter term way of dealing with things.
We'd have to do that at the circuit level, right?
Yeah.
We could do it localized.
How many, how many
Oh, no,
circuits,
you
how many
could-
circuits are there on the beach?
You could switch it off at the beach. I talked to Red about it. It's
You
it
could
takes a
use the
little,
o- You could use the overhead,
yes,
the overhead disconnects.
yes, yeah.
But it's still,
But if you have wind, can they do that?
it's done from the ground.
Oh, is it? Okay.
But if you
But-
don't
but
do
the
that,
real-
then you have
thing
to have
is,
everything high
where are you
enough
gonna
that it
build
never
to?
gets
What are you
wet.
gonna set
Because I
your
remember
standard
during high
to?
winds, people-
How high is that? And I'm a little confused
The
by,
winds have to go down
I always
below
have,
this level before they actually
by
get up.
NAD 88. Where is that?
There may be a few.
And where is
Keep on going.
NAD 88 plus 6? Or whatever.
So the NAVD 88 is the zero for
I
just about
understand
every
the
surveyor
definition.
and.
I just can't see it.
Yeah,
Um,
it act,
And you need to be there plus the high water plus
Yeah.
something that approximates the chance of a big storm, which FEMA deals with by, and the building code deals with by, a freeboard number, but doesn't have to be our number. So it needs to be, NAD 88 plus the current high water plus, sea level rise, plus whatever we want to have as a insurance factor.
so some.
And I don't know what that number is, but
Well, we should be able to calculate it, if just theoretically based on the assumptions. we
yeah,
made
I think
today.
we ought to be able to calculate it and then say, whoops, the drying beds are below that.
Mhm.
Or,
There's
maybe that's okay.
there's a NOAA report that I got back to. I've looked at it many other ways, but I got back to by one of the things that you linked in your email. Every year they update a report on high tide flooding predictions. And that's the thing that was in the West Cedar project that talks about, there being 100 days of nuisance flooding. And I think that's 1.75 feet to 2 feet above, I guess it's mean high water. And, now it's a couple days a year, and 2050, it could be as many as 90 days a year. Those guys have all the data necessary for us to figure out. And that's based on one scenario. We're talking about a higher scenario. That number may be higher. But we should be able to put that, we should be able to pin all those elevations.
I think that's sort of an attempt that ought to be made.
Well, I think we need that before we can move forward.
Yeah, I think
We have to
you
know
can
where
say,
we're
okay, it's
designing
too
to.
high, or, we'd all be looking up at it.
Well, I was hoping we could get to that, our initial assumptions today on that, because to see what we have to get to, and how does it impact living on the beach, I guess, or anything.
So that's why I asked the question a long time ago, and maybe I didn't explain it right. My sense is each of these different bullets has a different vulnerability, has a different sort of risk
Oh, I
tolerance
see, Jen.
for getting wet, and so on. I did GIS for years. I could imagine taking some way of ranking all, attributing all of these. And if we knew the elevations, I don't know if we do, that's asking a lot. We could come up with some estimates by overlaying it with topography. But there'd be a way of sort of evaluating where the weak points are in the system for any one of these dots. But as a class, if you can say, okay, these absolutely have to stay dry all the time. You know, these can get wet periodically. That helps, at least in my crazy mind, to get you to the point where you can do the calculus to do that.
I think,
This is the elevation that we need to build this to. We can deal with having elevations at a lower point for, you know, force mains, or I'm just picking numbers off the names off the.
Yeah,
I don't think it has to be one elevation for everything. It can't be.
well, I mean, the simplest is the water system. Okay, I think that's pressurized, you know, I think we control most of the things with the water system. pretty. I think the wastewater system is the most troublesome. The electric is portions of it troublesome because of the primarily power, pad mounted transformers, as long as the major metering stations and everything else are high enough. So to me, the wastewater is the key, and I think that's the thing we should be concentrated on, which I guess we are. for the most part.
I know if we were gonna come in and build a new wastewater plant, you would say, okay, what's the high water load? You get a number and you build everything 18 inches higher than that. 10 state standards is required, 1.5 higher. That's pretty straightforward in that regard. Now here we're doing forensics where do we really need to raise this to the same elevation as that requirement? And I would suggest that I can't think of any portion in terms of the wastewater, which is more what I know about, that you wouldn't do that. You would build it 18 inches higher than the high water expectation.
Yeah, and we should be able to calculate that.
Yeah.
I think that's-
we should,
that's
and
right.
except to Barbara's point last time, which is don't use the median line, use the top line,
I think that was an agreement
which,
from the last meeting that we're already assuming.
which, you know, translates to about a meter.
Was 23 inches based on Denrex graph.
On the middle line in 2050.
No, top line.
Top line.
Top line
When
was
was
23.
that publication? Because the numbers keep changing.
Okay, well, it was in the executive summary for the
Okay.
Denrex. And they said that in their, the rise was projected to be between 9 inches and 23 inches
For 2050.
for 2050. And
Okay,
23 inches was the top line.
So used to 23
Yes,
inches.
so we assumed 2050. It said it's going to be 2 feet. We just kind of rounded it.
Yeah,
That's what we agreed to last time.
And, you know, and this is all great because this discussion is perfect for sea level rise. But where the water side is at risk is for wind. Where the electrical side, the area is more at risk is from wind. So, I mean, and that really can be, you know, separated in the discussion. But, you know, just saying that the water system, you know, it's got its own set of risks with mitigation.
But again, the wing with the tower, we have 1 tower now, probably have 2 by then.
And controls, you know,
Yeah,
controls on that tower. and everything,
Yeah.
of course.
and then the treatment facilities.
Right.
So, and the wells, so. And our treatment facilities and wells are pretty far out, so that it's not likely to be something that we're gonna have to be worried too much about. Our committee.
To the point you just made, Tom, you know, I'm familiar, I've spent a lot of time looking at sea level rise, starting to look more at temperature information, because I think that's relevant to electrical demand. Provision of services, I guess, but I haven't seen anything. I know that there's projections about the role of climate change and what it will do for precipitation events. Is there something that gets at wind and how that sort of duration and intensity changes through time?
It's more related to, from what I've read, is it's the frequency of nor'easters and hurricanes and their slow speed that they're tending to move at versus historical trends.
So the
And-
duration, yeah.
Yeah, the duration, because that's something that, the last storms that hit North Carolina and Texas, they were totally prepared for. A, how quickly it sped up, and then B, how quickly it just sat there. And I've not read a lot that says that there's good modeling, there's, changes in the jet stream, changes in the Gulf Stream, but yes, empirically, it does seem to be that it's true. Rain events and wind events are becoming longer, more unpredictable, and we've had
More frequent.
and more frequent. We have more of these straight line wind events than historically did.
What kind of data is there? I mean, sea level rise has been discussed and calculated or estimated for a long time. In depth, how about what you're bringing up, the storm events, frequency and duration and intensity and
There, I can go back and look and see what I can find. That my sense is that there are some data. I don't know if they're quite as clean. There's a group at NOAA that's been doing this high tide flooding stuff for quite a while, and they're on top of that. I don't know if there's an equivalent group that's trying to look at it. I think there has to be somebody looking at storms.
NOAA's been tracking the storms, especially the impact on the Gulf Stream.
that'd be good to get if we could
But-
find that information.
But I think they're, as someone said, they're behind with sea level rise.
Yes, that's what concentration.
And it's a lot more, from what I've read, complicated to model.
Sure.
Well, again, can't we do an estimate based on what we just talked about sea level rise and what the height we have to address going forward?
I know, I would have
I'm for
to
that,
scratch my
even
head.
if it's wrong and we change it later.
So isn't it NAV 88 plus
2 feet?
the 100-year storm event plus 2 feet?
Yeah.
And then we can debate whether it's,
If it was
You
9
put a
feet,
freeboard on top of that,
yeah,
right?
so what would that be?
Well, okay, so
Yeah, I kept
In-
thinking,
in-
I could keep thinking this 9 elevation that we've been building to. And so I see everything going up 2 feet. So we're now at 11,
Right.
we're building to,
right, it's actually 9, it's actually plus the freeboard. The only thing you would add to that would be the freeboard,
so it'd be 12 and a half.
something like that. That's kind of what I'm imagining.
That's pretty high in the air.
It
yeah,
is.
but and I think whether they have freeboard or not is a big question, because these are engineered structures versus in home building, you're talking about uncertainties and, other things. And
And it's also, we've also chosen the highest curve at the
Right.
beginning.
Right.
Which helps to reduce because at least the way the freeboard has been explained to me is it was sort of the fudge factor.
Correct.
It bought us some latitude. When you go to that higher standard, you don't need quite as much of that latitude.
right, and
Except
In
you're talking
general-
critical.
if you set
Yep.
less than 12 inches, it affects your insurance rates.
Correct.
So that the insurance companies want you at least 12 inches of margin. The most common number is 18, but other places use
Would that
24.
apply to utilities like us with those?
That I don't know. That's something we really probably should talk about, our insurance company.
Yeah.
But over the next 30 years, don't you think it's likely we're going to see a change in the floodplain? Granted, we're talking now, the numbers that exist now, my sense is when was the last time the floodplain was updated?
15 was the new maps, and actually a lot of the elevations in the city dropped. Some of the down on the beach areas, they were like an AE8, now a lot of them are AE7s. because of the new technology, is what that the numbers shifted.
The
It
technology
added,
tends to
it
do it
added
well.
some, like on the Pollitt Town
Yeah.
area, a lot of those got added. But a lot of the beach areas dropped in number. So that made a little difference when the city decided to add freeboard. If somebody in, say, '05 was an AE8, when the new maps came out in 15, they dropped to an AE7. Adding 18 inches of freeboard realistically only hurt them 6 inches.
And the last conversation I had with FEMA, which was probably several months ago, was they said, do not expect any changes to the flood maps for 5 years.
The last revision was when?
15.
So we're past that.
No,
No.
this was 5 years from when I talked to them.
Oh.
So we're talking 2027.
Okay.
They said it is politically not tenable. There is so much infighting and the technology and numbers are changing so quickly. And their recommendation, if I've ever heard, is that locales going on their own. You either accept the 500-year flood, you increase your freeboard, you put some other type of fudge factor in. And that's kind of where Norfolk, Florida, PAC, Massachusetts, New York are all going, is they're going in on their own, which is a hell of a statement for
Yeah.
Just to
a clearinghouse to say.
just to complicate things, when I think we brought this up, the executive order 41, are you familiar with this?
What was that?
In the Markel administration, it was after a climate assessment has been done. They actually declared, I can look it up, I can send it to you guys, that's what I'll do, but it directed at least state agencies that managed and built critical infrastructure. I don't know if they used quite that phrase.
This is what Del Dot is working to.
Right, but I think other agencies were part of it. I don't know if it extends to municipalities. But given what we're talking about in critical infrastructure, one of the standards that they looked at was the floodplain. Plus, they were throwing 3 feet of sea level rise on top. And I don't know how that fits with what number we would put, whether it would be 3 or 5 feet or something. That was a pretty big number. But that may be another thing to examine. I don't know whether whether PPW falls under the requirements of Executive Order 41. It was primarily, I have interpreted every time I've looked at it for Del Dot and big highway projects and bridges and so on. And frankly, the Canary Creek Bridge does not meet that standard because they decided that it wasn't an
The new
official
one?
evacuation
The
route.
proposed one or this?
The proposed one. The elevations are going to be lower than what the executive
Right.
order requires. But anyway, while we're sitting here, I'll try to look it up.
Yeah, my understanding that was strictly state. They have no jurisdiction over.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you said we're not going to, because I think you make a good point that engineered structures. That board, we're going to have that. It's probably not something that is that right?
Or a lower number. I mean, I think, that's something we can get GMB or GHD or whoever to chime in on. I mean, because in engineering terms, I mean, you guys will know, there's always a factor of safety that you put in there, whether it needs to be the same as we're using in the building codes. I'm not sure. And so it would, our insurance companies would help to dictate that. Because I don't know whether our insurance rates would change for our assets.
Should we ask the state whether they would make a requirement of 18 inches? Which is what they do now, they say build it to 10 state standards. And they just expect it to have that extra 18 inches of freeboard.
Does the 10 state standards actually specify that?
I believe it's 10 state, there's some standard. I believe it's 10 state standards requires.
Because the state actually doesn't from a building code perspective, dictate to Freeboard.
They don't.
No,
Okay.
that's between you, your insurance, and FEMA flood insurance. Because your FEMA flood insurance rate increases
Mhm.
if you don't meet, and I think it's 12 inches, Robin. Isn't that the
Well,
minimum?
They've come out with a new methodology on how they're doing flood
Oh,
insurance now.
that's true,
That
the
just came out.
2.0 or whatever they
Yeah,
call it.
risk rating 2.0, yeah.
It used to be.
It's not just off the maps anymore. It's off of your proximity to the source of the storms, and
Is it done on individual properties and not swaths of land?
it's individuals, yeah, it's all individuals now, yeah. Yeah, it all comes into play. I mean, how the levels of your first floors and things like that, but it's not just that anymore.
Yeah.
So it's
I
identified
forgot.
specific
Yeah.
property, yeah.
Yeah, because some of them went up, started in October, I think, and then April was some new ones, and it's changing. It's
During the resiliency committee presentations, they described how this new method, but it wasn't rolled out at that point, but
Yes.
how it was going to work.
correct.
What's to press, I keep trying to complicate things. No, I'm trying to help. What's the floodplain designation AE number for the Seymour plant?
It's 6 and 7. I think that lot is 6
Yeah.
and 7. I think the plan is in a 7, I think, if I'm not mistaken, but it's probably find it somewhere.
I think that's correct. The land, there's a portion of it that is,
6, and that's closer to the canal, I think.
yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive.
So if I've done my math right, and we should verify this, that would be 10 and a half, 18-inch freeboard. Now D88 plus
Right.
7, right? Where's that AE is from NAV D88, or is it done from Minara Water?
It's 88. It's done from 88.
So 7 feet for AE7 plus 24 inches makes 9 plus 18 inches is 10 and a half.
That's present designation, right?
Yep.
That's gonna change.
At some point.
Just say that again.
Oh, part
7
of the
feet
plan's at
now.
6.
7 feet.
A7
There it is.
is NAV D88 plus 7 for the 1% storm, the 100-year floodplain. Plus what we said we'd round out to 24 inches for the sea level rise
Sea level rise,
figure.
2050.
And then we add whatever freeboard number between the 10 state minimum and whatever. You're looking at maybe 10 or 10 and a half feet.
Yeah, I was thinking 11, because
Yeah.
I keep going back to that elevation 9 that we built to today.
Yeah,
If you're adding 2 feet,
Yeah.
you're at 11.
I'm not gonna argue a higher number.
No,
I'm not gonna argue against that. So where does that put us? With that
Wow.
elevation certificate that you just did?
The oxidation ditches are at 9.5, And the-
9.6.
and that continues into the base elevation for both buildings.
We have a meeting with them tomorrow, with the engineers working on that, on the long-term need for a treatment plant. I wonder if they've gotten to that point. They should, I assume they should have.
I assume they
So we should see what they've come up with. They're looking at the long-term viability of keeping this plant as one of the options. So it'll be interesting to see what they've come to,
Mhm.
their evaluations.
So again, it's, how many times, I think about the fire drill with what I call the fire drill with the drying beds.
Mhm.
You know, is that an absolute never can get wet? Those 9.5 elevations you just cited, we want to make sure that it never gets flooded, particularly with salt water.
Well, yeah, you don't want that in your biological process. That's on the oxidation ditch. That's not the drying beds. Drying beds are anywhere from 5.8 to 6.5, I think.
Yeah, and there's mitigation plans. I mean, you can empty the drying beds before a storm comes. sweep them so that you don't get run off into the canal. I mean,
Can you,
there's other ways.
can you isolate the drainage from
Are you talking from,
the drying beds?
No.
I don't think so.
That goes back to
Headworks.
the headwork, so
Yeah.
if that gets flooded, then that
That's a
water.
good point. There's no isolation valve on that drain?
No, but you could theoretically, if
Plug
it did get
drains.
flooded, you could plug it, but you could also pump it to the clarifier. Because it already comes back into the clarifier anyway.
Okay,
We-
the other-
we
the
talked
other
about
day you
putting
mentioned that
inflatable
there's
seals.
mechanical,
Remember that one on these?
There's what?
there's mechanical dewatering.
Yes, yeah, belt filter press.
But- So will we totally eliminate all the beds? Filter press? Yeah. I'm gonna go to the filter press. I thought that would take care of the drying bed issue.
Well, it would,
Yeah.
because you can do, and I forget what Rich said he's doing in a normal day. I think he said in a day, he can do like 6 drying beds worth of material. But if you have a chance for flooding, you just don't pour.
Or
Or,
going forward, I mean, we should eliminate them. Get that out of the picture. If they're the weak spots, they're not even meeting our elevations.
Is it expensive to run and maintain the press alternative to the drying bed?
no, it's just then you talk about redundancy. So if you're getting rid of the drying beds and you're relying on the mechanical process, what happens when the mechanical process fails?
Yeah.
Then you're pumping.
You can keep it as
Yeah.
backup, but not as primary.
Yeah.
What kind of capital investment would that be?
Anywhere from, depends on if you do new, if you do reman, 250 to 400,000 for a belt filter press.
That sounds like we're doing. I mean,
It's in the budget.
It's in the- Yeah, we've already budgeted.
So on that 9.5 elevation, maybe this is what the contractors are already doing, but, are there ways of fortifying those, protecting those?
That's exactly what they're doing.
Okay.
If the plant stays where it is today, planning for what the future has to hold, what has to be done at that plant.
And how to do
We
it.
don't know yet.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, it's. The ground slopes away quite a ways. It's all silty soil. We're with you to build
American Legion
dikes.
Road is low. Although, isn't Del raising Town Road at the end? Didn't I hear that?
Yes.
You're gonna raise that 3 feet or something?
To the same elevation as what, for the what, the
Same
10-year?
elevation as the bridge.
10-year storm was
Yeah.
what it said in the paper.
And not replace the bridge.
And make the road skinnier
Yes,
for a bigger. crowd.
Yes. Quite a bit skinnier.
yes.
I missed that. So,
Because they can't disturb the wetlands.
Yeah.
So they're gonna start with the existing road.
all right.
Raise the
And then
crown.
They have to slope it.
All right, so, wetlands are gonna grow. As all this sea level rises, the wetland extent will, it will start moving uphill. So that's another factor. But somebody just said American Legion Road. Or
Yeah, I
you
just said
said about
American Legion
Road.
You know, that's one of the issues getting to
Yeah.
the treatment plant. You leave it there.
Right.
That's because, but if you can raise it a couple feet,
What's the elevation of the road right now? What's the lowest point?
4, less than 4.
Is American Legion a Delta road?
I'm saying we could do it. That's-
Oh, I'm
that's-
sorry,
that's a-
misunderstood. I think you said
If
Delta.
you want to
Two.
keep that plan,
2. I mean,
Oh, there you go. Perfect.
it's 2.
So
yeah,
are you,
right there.
are you finding this tool useful? I think this is a really
Oh, yeah.
fabulous tool and canvas for your benefit. If you've never seen this,
Well,
this is, I think, something that could be used as part of the notification consideration for property owners. This
Oh,
is
good,
a
good
fabulous
point,
tool.
yep.
that can't be 2 because the marsh is 2. It's higher than that.
Oh, it's what I'm saying.
Let's say it's 4.
Yeah, I mean, you got 5,
Maybe
4 here, but there's a
3,
little
maybe-
dip as you
yeah.
come through here.
Actually, I think this is the link that was talked about in the,
It probably was, because there were so many links kind of thrown out there, but isolating and identifying them are
the
helpful.
problem is that this is great information. I'm not sure how useful it is to a lay buyer.
Well,
Well,
so
Just
just
a different question.
just
Maybe
while
they'll
we're
even
here,
Pay attention,
pick-
or they're busy looking at.
click on
windows or
click on the
doors.
plant. Just click on the middle of the plant. All right, and what it's gonna do is it's gonna pull up the parcel that contains that plant. Now you see here this menu that came up. You can scroll through those things, but hit the more details. And now you have to just try to open up just draw, you can pull up the top of the box. There you go. Maybe not, I don't know how to do it. All right, so these are the important numbers here. So the ground elevation height at the parcel is 1 to 7. The approximate PFE range at parcel is 6 to 7, right? So I don't know if they've got the language in there, but people can write then and there, tell what the elevations of their parcel are. It can't account for the building construction, the freeboard, all of those things. I had a house that was old enough that it didn't meet the current standard. Right. And so everybody's going to have to evaluate that, but to have those numbers is really kind of useful.
So also I noticed while we did our visit that the sludge tank and the airs and blowers and all of those are standing, all that is very low. And the electric in there is pretty low too. It doesn't have,
You're talking where the digesters are?
yeah,
Yeah, where you walk in the door underneath.
yeah.
Yeah.
And those nice new airsons,
Yeah.
those are in trouble.
Mhm.
So what kind of elevation are you talking there?
It's whatever grade
Yeah,
is
it's
for
right
that.
about at grade. They're
Yeah.
not lifted at all, including the power sources too.
Some are underneath the building too.
There's a little bit, but there's not.
Some pumps or something.
Yeah.
So that sludge digester building is at risk.
Yeah, that's
Substantial
being
risk.
studied by GHD right now, so that's.
But I mean, if you have, even if you're going to go to a belt filter press, you're still going to need all of that equipment.
I know, it means studied by GHD for the long range,
How we're going to address
Oh,
that.
which
I see.
option we go to,
Yeah,
how to harden the plant.
I see.
So I'm looking forward to seeing what those guys come up with.
that'd be interesting tomorrow.
But assuming that they come up with something, that leaves all this other stuff. How do you deal with all that? Do we just sort of say the most important is figuring out the plant and the rest of it?
No. I think we have to figure out and be comfortable with what elevation to design to. Right? That's what this meeting could produce,
Okay.
or at least the first step towards it. Because I mean, how can we move forward without knowing what we're designing to? So, and what I'm getting, I keep thinking it's 11 is the elevation. It just goes my thing from 9 today to 2 foot rise 2050. That sounds like the number we're heading towards. Now, I don't know if I can support it well enough without more input from you guys, but or from the staff.
I mean, I would run it by these guys.
Yeah, we'll see what
the
GHD does.
contractors say,
Yeah.
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 We'll see what they say tomorrow in our meeting.
But that seems like a pretty reasonable number.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, once again, they're only looking at the wastewater treatment plant, not
But they're coming up.
everything else.
They're
The
gonna-
other assets.
They should be looking at what the conditions are going to be in 2050. That's what are they designing for that, which should apply to other utility facilities.
Well, and if you have your 11 or whatever that number
We have
is,
to be able to be
you
able
can
to-
then say, okay, this pump station is below that, and maybe we wouldn't need to worry about it, and that other pump station is not, and we don't need to worry about it. And you can start to prioritize some of those things.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it looks like, everything on town side, all the pumping stations are probably okay. And all the things on the beach side, no surprise.
How about out by Hornkill and
That's a good question.
Yeah, how about back here
maybe
and
it's
then
over
also
by,
over in here? This is the other area that we need to keep an eye
new
on,
annexation?
right? Like down here where
Well,
Sussex
Ebenezer
Drive
Branch
and
goes-
Ebenezer Branch, right, exactly.
Yeah.
All of this area is pretty low in here. And then the area back at the end of Harbor View and Hornkill.
I bet if you said 11 is a number,
Mhm.
you'd say, oh,
That's
this pump station, that
Mhm.
other thing, this transformer.
Do you have
needs to-
elevation?
Needs to be looked at.
Do you do you routinely collect the elevations of things as you put them in, things like manhole covers and stuff like that?
We get them from when we get as-built, but we have, like on the asset side, we did it on the asset management program. But once you determine what that level is gonna be, if it's gonna be 11, I mean, we have all the equipment to go out and do it. So we can take elevations with our Trimble unit.
I worry that 11 may not be.
why.
I wrote down 11 and a half because,
Yeah.
because of the way you had it.
Yeah.
But-
Yeah.
But we should have something that we can support. And that's what I'm digging for.
But that doesn't allow for freeboard at all, does it?
No,
Well, but,
the rough calculation I gave was NAVD 88 plus AE 7 plus 2 feet of sea level rise plus 18 inches was 10 and a half.
Oh, okay.
Did I do that right? Did I leave something out? Did I leave a factor out?
0 plus 100-year flood is
7 plus
feet.
2 is 9, plus 18 inches is 10 and a half.
Right.
And if you
Oh,
use
yeah,
a
I'm
few
sorry.
more inches of sea level rise, or freeboard, you'd be at presses 11.
But if you're gonna use the AE numbers, then it's the zone that it's in, because some of them could be 8, some of them could be 9, some of them could be 5.
Right. Right. I took
You-
that calculation based
the
on, he
wastewater
seems to be
treatment.
focused on
Yeah.
Seymour plant, but
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you take 11 at the wastewater treatment plant and you project that across,
Mhm.
it could be more than that, to your point.
Yeah.
Like if you're in zone 4.
Yeah.
It's gonna be another 2 feet.
Yes,
So if you have your Excel spreadsheet, you get the zones, then you just add it across.
you could just do that, just
Yeah.
potentially use the zone that you're in, plus the fixed number of 2 feet and 18
And then
inches.
it equals
Yeah.
the sum at the end.
Correct.
Okay, so those AE numbers, what do they stand for?
It's,
AE 7, AE.
so in the flood, in the FEMA flood studies, the blue color, the sort of over the,
Right.
just a general blue covering you see there over the satellite map is the 1% storm, what it's also referred to as the 100-year floodplain.
Okay.
All right. And AE is one of several classifications that's based on where that flooding is occurring. Is it happening? If you notice at the top of the screen, the cross hatching is VE. That's a velocity zone. That's you have waves crashing up against the shore. AE is what's considered still water flooding. I'm kind of oversimplifying, right?
Just, yeah, but you're right, yeah, that's to make it, yeah.
And so then they looked at an historical analysis. It's the first thing that we need to keep in mind with flood maps. It's an historical analysis looking backward and developing a probability that, as far as I know, Robin, doesn't include sea level rise in its consideration. So that right there, the quote I heard from a FEMA guy at one of the Delaware Rascal conferences in Oswald runs. The day these maps come out, they're outdated. So anyway, what they do is they look at the historical storms. They then run some modeling that considers where those storms typically track, what the typical winds would be, what the landscape looks like. So you get this whole thing that tries to account for the fact the water comes into Roosevelt Inlet and it's going to sort of come up from there. So if you go down the canal back toward Roosevelt Inlet, the numbers change, right? Don't they go from like AE7 here back down to AE9 closer to the inlet?
Yeah, the closer to the water, I mean, again, you look at Bayview Avenue, there's an AE9 right there. Then you're coming this way, you get an AE.
Right. It has to do, there's considerations for the topography and the wind directions and all that. It's kind of a black box. I hate tell you all the stuff that goes
But
in there.
what do the numbers mean? The 7, the 8?
Oh, that's
So that's the
elevation.
elevation. That's
That's
the,
elevation.
that's an elevation buffer, if you will, above the NAVD 88 zero
So if you take
elevation.
sea level rise, 7 would mean, in simplistic terms, it's 7 feet above sea level rise or sea level.
Yeah, NAVD 88.
During that storm.
No,
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 no.
Just the water will get to that point sometime once every 100 years,
okay.
historically based. Which now is
How many
4
100-year
times
storms have we had in the last?
Yeah.
Right,
4 in the
so-
last 10. Let's just count it.
So, I don't know, I haven't done it recently, but the storm that Preston referred to, the winter storm Jonas,
Jonas, yeah.
January 23rd, 2016.
Right.
You can gin up from other data that are right on here. We could click some buttons and look at it right now, what the maximum, kind of get an idea what the maximum extent of water was on that day. Now, every time we talk about these, I always qualify. All the numbers that we have regarding sea level rise and historical data for flooding are all taken from a water level meter that's out at the Lewis ferry dock. Okay, that's on one side of the beach, right? Out in the open behind the inner wall and the breakwater wall and all that. You can imagine it's a whole different matter. But whatever water is getting pushed up during a nor'easter, like we saw the Mother's Day storm, that water gets pushed in over multiple tide cycles through Roosevelt Inlet, and it basically just kind of ratchets up inside the Great Marsh and in the canal. So it doesn't work necessarily perfectly with what's going on out on the ferry terminal. So we don't have any, as far as I know, we don't have any gauges.
Yeah.
I think it'd be really good.
Yeah,
This might be the group that
We've been
wants to
talking
invest
about
in
it for
some
ages.
some water level gauges around town that gets at some of the critical areas, over here, somewhere along here, we can actually track and develop an understanding of how water levels change at the Cape Lewis Ferry. The Lewis at Breakwater Harbor site that NOAA has 100 years of data versus what happens in the areas that matter to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about it last time. I think I brought it up that Jonas is supposed to be the highest storm we've had. It's 3 feet lower than the mark that it shows for the 62 storm.
But, one of the things is that, what Sumner said is 100% true, but what's in addition to that is the flow coming down the Delaware River. Because when you get 5 consecutive high tides that are being backed up, all the water coming down from up north gets backed up. And so that's why the back bay flooding tends to be more severe for us. Not saying that a Cat 3 hurricane
Well, good
in
job.
Bethany
Right.
wouldn't destroy us,
Right.
but historically,
Right.
we have been much more at risk
Affected by
for
those, yeah.
nor'easters and back bay flooding events.
Right, and those are all based on, as you said before, how often you have storms that come in or through or park themselves in this area that develop a northeast circulation that pushes water to the south shore of the Delaware Bay and into all the areas that matter to us. And for how long does it last? Like that May storm, it was 5 days, right? So that's a lot of high tide cycles for that water to
Better add
ratchet
another
up.
foot.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's that?
Add another foot.
No. So that's why I asked about, I don't know what the NOAA sense of frequency, duration, magnitude of storms looks like over this sort of time frame. That might exacerbate things, but that is not something that FEMA looks at when they develop their floodplain analysis.
No, it isn't. That's
Yeah.
right.
And
You
it's
know,
something,
you can get a 6-inch rain
Yeah.
and
and FEMA has said that, it's physically impossible. I mean, especially, Roosevelt Inlet is probably the star child of an example. It is a lens. And the north-south direction of where the eye of the storm is will grossly impact how much water gets pushed up into it. Whether it gets reflected back out or whether it goes in.
Or comes down.
Yeah, and, you know, anyone basing an analysis on that without understanding that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty.
Yes.
Well, for now, we're gonna use 10.5 or 11 for our present. This could, as we get more data, we see GH.
11, but
Can
I'll
we-
make
can we
it 12.
Can we,
Yeah.
support- can we support that? And it's gonna impact.
We can certainly support that.
Okay, well, I'm there, but let's see what GHD, where they came, and that would help support that number.
Yeah, I think we need to
I'll
understand what the
support
consequences
the
are. I think everyone knows I'm supportive of being conservative, but it also has to be livable.
Yeah.
And that's gonna be a big question going forward. I mean, my portion of the world there.
Right, and one of the things, I don't think we talked about this when, several times, we had Brent Jett from GMB as part of our conversation in the Sea Level Rise Committee. But you mentioned American Legion Road, and yeah, sure, we can raise the road. But we spent a fair amount of time talking about the challenges of raising a bunch of roads over on the beach and how that confounds the stormwater situation over there. So it's not all simple.
Yeah.
You know, we create all these little stormwater basins where all the
And again, that's not
water.
even in our considerations. That should be GHD's review when they're saying that could be viable going forward. See what they say about that.
So to your point, if I remember correctly, one of the things that was discussed during the resiliency was if you raise the roads, you can have unintended consequences of creating flooding in
Sure.
owners' properties
Backyards,
because you've elevated it, the water has no place to go, it can't go over the road because you've elevated it so high. And then that backwash then creates real issues in other places. Yeah.
It could be helpful too, because the marsh is raising.
And then
up.
it can't leave,
That can be,
and then the water can't go
That would,
anywhere.
help
sometimes,
people on the other side. Of the
Right.
road.
Right.
Each
Yeah,
side of the
it
road.
might facilitate emergency
We,
egress, but it doesn't necessarily
Help everybody.
help everybody down the road.
I'm just gonna caution, we're talking about beach sand. It allows water to move through it pretty well. So, you know, unless we're fundamentally modifying the medium that underlies the entire area up there, water's gonna move through the soil and under the soil as much as it's gonna move or not move through whatever barriers we set up along the streets.
Yeah, we really don't want to create barriers.
But to the extent that it's not already saturated.
Right, exactly. That's an important point.
All right, well, I think it'll be interesting to hear what they say tomorrow with their terms on this. But where do we go from here? I mean, I keep thinking at some point, these areas aren't going to be livable. And how do we take that? I think it's more a city thing than our thing.
So when a major event comes and the
Yeah.
areas,
2050, when the water level's already risen,
right,
and then.
or in combination with a major storm event.
Yeah. Well, they're
You've
gonna-
got the destruction of homes and therefore the livability becomes answered, or a part of the question gets answered.
So the livability, I've done a lot of things
It's
about
the
this.
2-foot one.
I think it comes down to the individual's tolerance. I mean, at some point, it seems like an emergency space. But every homeowner may have a different tolerance for this. And you made a really important point. A lot of people come down here in the summer, they buy a house, they don't realize how it changes in the
Because
winter.
they're not here all year round.
Right.
Yeah.
They make the mistake of not being here. Or they just haven't had the experience
Right.
to
Right.
give them that understanding. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But this is where that high tide flooding stuff we were talking about earlier comes in. What's your tolerance? How many times are you willing to put up with water up against your house, a foot up your house? You know, how often are you willing to muck out your basement or whatever it might
Again,
be?
it might first house, had living space down there now,
Yeah.
because they haven't been here through a storm.
Okay, so here's the important stuff. So, depending on the elevation, right? I can put the numbers together. I don't have them right now, but the guys that put together these annual assessments of high tide flooding and the scenarios for the coming year and the next decade and so on. And I think I've shared with Austin this website that's based on those data. It tries to get it visualizing different ways of visualizing the problem. But the numbers that I was looking at this morning, nuisance flooding around here might happen 5-6 days a year. Does that sound reasonable? By the year 2050, that'll be 65 to 90 days a year. That's 3 months out of every year that you might, if you have nuisance flooding now and you're worried 5 days a year, by the year 2050, it's going to be 3 months out of the year. You've got that same situation.
25% every year.
Yeah. So, how much is the city going to be willing to spend in 30 years to deal with streets being flooded? I think for us, whenever you get done with the plant and all those considerations, the next thing in my mind comes down to, right, all these points that are out there, the pump stations, all these other things that I don't really understand enough yet. But then the other piece is the stormwater system and how that works and how that, just like we've been, the West Cedar study has shown, that nuisance flooding thing I'm talking about, that's going to raise the stakes. And it's also going to enlarge the area that's subject to the kind of problems that West Cedar's dealing with.
Well, we're doing the study between the BPW and the city, and we're doing a study of all of Cedar. Because we were looking at doing the water and sewer at Cedar, but we're also doing a water assessment to confirm or prolong the replacement or renewal of that, both the side streets, the towns and the states, and the water, sewer, and then there's also discussion of stormwater. But with that, there's a coordination between both the city and the Board of Public Works, but there's also a coordination with DelDOT, because that DelDOT is the person behind the curtain on a lot of these projects, because when you talk about Pilot Town Road, state road, you talk about Kings Highway, state road, Savannah Road, state road, and that planning aspect that comes with DelDOT. The conversation came up when they were raising the road down at the end of Pilot Town Road because of utilities. My plan, and not speaking on behalf of the board, would be to replace the water line from the Lewis area all the way down to the bridge with
You guys
that project.
this project that's just finishing up now, that stopped at the dairy.
Yes.
Okay.
And the new project to reduce the low spot. Right, and pick up from there to the bridge.
But like what press has been saying about what's the long term, or whatever you want to say, 2050. This is something we talked about in the planning subcommittee. What's life going to look like over here? At what point do we have to seriously reconsider what's going on over here? And the same is true for that last bit of Pilot Town Road, right?
Yeah.
How long can the businesses make it out there?
Yeah,
At the
so,
end.
Candace, one of the things, before the subcommittee was formed, planning commission was hearing on the flood events.
Right.
And that got shut down, but we wanted a long-term plan for Lewis Beach, not to implement it for today, but so that when Hurricane Gertrude came, we weren't behind the 8 ball. And that's where we're back to now. And, it's not forced evacuation or retreat now, but that in the case of the event, we would have at least groundwork of where to start from.
To recover and replace in a manner that would be appropriate,
Right, or whether you're
Whether that's just
or whether or not, or
Yeah, I mean,
maybe you don't.
Right,
Right.
but not to be put in the position like the New Jersey coast was, where they were caught flat-footed, and then they had to start the process
To
And
think
have
through all
the-
these things,
and have those debates during everyone is disrupted.
right?
And
And everybody's screaming for restoration of services, and they don't have a plan.
so, I
Right.
mean, that's one of the things that-
Transformers are being requisitioned,
I'm hoping that Mayor and City Council will take up from the original sea level rise committee that got abandoned in the follow-on
The
study.
other interesting property is this one, whatever happens with this long term, because this is pretty low.
So
But-
the challenge I see, or one of the challenges I see with Mayor and City Council looking at some of the things that the resiliency committee considered is that expertise is required to kind of augment the thinking, because council members are not from that field, you know, we don't have any engineers on our cohort, and so that's where collaboration with BPW is key, but then probably some outside experts to look at
Oh, yeah.
those questions, because you can give an opinion, but unless it's an educated opinion, it's not really useful.
But sea level rise, we had,
That's,
But
I
you have
mean,
to
that I
kind of give
understand.
Yeah,
mayor and
I'm
city
just saying, what does the
council
city do?
Right, but I
something to
mean,
act on.
yeah,
What
the
are your
expertise was, I mean, we had NOAA.
Oh, for sure.
FEMA.
Oh, no, I'm not questioning that part of the expertise. I guess where I'm going is, some of the questions that might be postulated is if you have a major storm and this whole area is destroyed, what does the city say about rebuilding? That's a city question.
And the BPW one. 'cause
And the
we have-
DPW ultimately, because of the utilities and the infrastructure to support it, but correct me if I'm wrong, but in the city code, we don't have anything that speaks to total rebuild of homes in the event of a disaster.
Not eligibility to do it or not. And again, right now,
Right.
something
It's
happens,
not
they would-
spoken
yeah.
to in the code. So
Well,
that's kind of
Do
one
the
of the
leases
questions
cover
which
that at all?
would be hugely inflammatory,
I don't
but
think the leases cover
I
anything to
don't
do
think
with
it
rebuilds and
discusses
things like
that.
that. If it's, if it gets damaged or knocked down during the storm, I don't think the lease agreements have any reference to that.
No,
Yeah.
and the
What
city
if
code,
somebody abandons a lease?
and so
Yeah.
the city code unfortunately does speak
That's
to it
an
because
problem.
it
That's what
cites
happened out in New Jersey, some of the
the
places.
flood
They
zone
just,
and the FEMA.
I can't do it.
Parts
And
of
allows
it,
you to
They
build.
parts of
away.
it, but not in a comprehensive way.
Well,
because-
but
They
it
can't
would allow
afford
you
it,
to
so I can't afford to
rebuild
rebuild. I can't
Right,
afford to bring
exactly
it up to
the
the
way
new
you are
standards.
now.
So they walked away from them.
Oh, you know, with freeboard.
And
Mm-hmm.
then
until,
the
unless
municipalities
that
were
gets
stuck
changed.
with
Right,
tearing them down,
understood.
handing
All right,
them down.
Let's talk about,
But not
let's
the
talk about where we
landowners,
go
though.
from here.
The leaseholders, they weren't stuck with it.
Well, this, our case would be different because of the leaseholders and here, yeah.
Let's talk about where we go from here. So we've got an idea what we're thinking about as far as elevation to mitigate. But we're not gonna design this stuff. I mean, we come up with concepts for sealing the sewer system. I don't know, reinforcing aerial wiring, I don't know. We're gonna need ideas from staff and our engineers before we finish this thing out, but we just have to come up with what we feel the job is that has to be done at this point. So how far do we take this?
So,
We gotta get the engineers involved.
so we have spent most of the time talking about sea level rise. Coincident with that, there are these other impacts of climate change, right? I'm just looking for things that are changing conditions that affect your operation, right? And I don't know how this works. And I looked up some numbers this morning. And I'm sure we can find the 2050 equivalent, the number that was in, there's a recent Delaware Climate Action Plan that was put together by DENREC. I don't know if you've seen it. But in there, it has a bunch of numbers about temperature differences, as well as another piece that looks at storm duration, frequency, magnitude, all that kind of stuff. But the temperature thing suggested, and I think it was in year 2100, that the average temperatures will go up 2.5 to 4 degrees. That sounds like a lot to me. I don't know what it translates to in terms of cooling degree days, heating degree days, but I'm assuming it exercises some burden on your ability to handle the demand for power. And then you couple into that some of the conversation we had, we were wondering on the wastewater treatment plant and electrification of transportation fleet. Let's put a little plug in for electric bikes instead of electric cars, and I'll leave it at that for today. Is that something?
Well,
We
that
should
number,
be
and that
talking
number
about.
you cited actually is the number that understates it, because that's 2.5 degrees on average. If you dig into that study, the peaks, like the 100 degrees we had for 4 days, are actually much larger. So the weather, the thermal weather actually is becoming more unstable. And the average isn't moving as much as the upward and downward peaks are. And that is not only locally, that is across the board what the industry is seeing. We're actually in a worse case from a transmission perspective than that.
Yeah, so here was by 2050, Delaware is projected to have 2 to 8 days per year to reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a 2014 analysis by Denrek. I don't know if that still holds up today. By mid-century, Delaware climate projections indicate an average of 3 to 5 nights per year where nighttime temperatures stay above 80. Again, I'm assuming that speaks to electrical load.
And also sagging electrical wires, right? Fires.
Ultimately, it goes back to we have one feed that comes into town, so we're relying on most DP&L, but we also are unique because being out on the coast, we are one of, if not the only, that I can come up with my head that sit on the coast in the state of Delaware that also run their own utilities, meaning the electric. Everything else is DP&L or Delaware Electric Co-op. What I was doing is everybody was talking was going around looking at Fenwick, looking at Dewey, and looking what they do as far as transformers. And if one of them was right here, which is down in Fenwick, and there you can see on one side of the road they have what looks to be like a 2-foot, but that is, if you look at a map of where that is, it's surrounded by water. I mean, water on 3 sides.
Look how high that water is in the canal.
Yeah.
And then you flip over on this side, and you see.
Oh,
So
yeah.
same thing, if you go to Dewey, it's most of Dewey is all overhead, but as you get farther down towards the Indian River Bridge, I pass it every day, it converts to underground. But even in Dewey, they're using pad mounts that are, either at grade, maybe a foot high, maybe 2 feet. But it's interesting between, Delaware Electric Co-op and DP&L.
So my sense is their scenarios, I haven't looked at the AE numbers, but my sense is that I think the tide fluctuations are lower here. I think that AE elevations are lower for the floodplain, but I could be wrong. They may be able to get away with those down there. I mean, Dewey, I think or Bethany rather, is one of the lowest lying areas in the whole state.
Yeah, my house is 9.
Okay, so then it's the same.
9 in the backyard, 10 in the front yard. So there's 6.
So you're gonna see your tent in the front yard?
Yeah.
But you do bring them a good
Let me
point.
recommend that.
Global warming, that's one thing we haven't gotten to at all at this point. And with the power system, we have a lot of variables happening in the industry in general. Because of EVs, now electric ferries, that type of thing. So there are many things that we gotta look at that are not even related to climate change.
I think I lost some ability to retain all the things that we talked about walking around at the plant. I'm kind of feeling like I want to go again sometime, but one of the things that was most memorable in the whole thing was something you said about the wind.
Mhm.
10%. What was the number you said?
Well, we've had instances where the windmill actually takes 100% of the load of that circuit. I mean, that's how much that windmill produces. this instance, the windmill's down. If anybody's ever has taken notice to it,
Yeah.
it's not operational right now. It doesn't cause a problem to us. What I'm saying is there's a benefit there for that thing running. Being that we are on the end of an extension cord, as Tom loves to say, if DP&L goes down from their midway substation to us, it's black. I mean, there's no sugarcoating that. We've had active discussions with DP&L about bringing in some sort of second line. One, it's very costly, and two, they want to burden obviously us, and there's no real capacity.
Well,
to bring it.
You mean in the grid out there?
Yeah, I mean, all your substations, I mean, the constant development that's happening both from DEC and DP&L. It's, I forget, we looked at it.
I know you don't know specifically, but if they do go with electric ferries like they're talking about, we have the ability to service that. I mean, that's,
No,
so like, I think you pointed out, that might be a boon to us.
Yeah,
And
and
they have to bring another line in.
neither does Cape May, but we probably should defer this conversation.
so it just adds to the, and like, for example, just talking about that transformer, it's at elevation 2.
Right, I mean, given all this elevation stuff, that whole area is in trouble.
Well, you
Look at
probably
those
ought-
numbers right
ought to
there.
Start looking at raising transformers, but keep saying it would be very expensive to bring in a second source of supply. But if you don't, you really haven't addressed the issue of mitigation at all.
And that's why we,
On the electrical side.
yeah, and we've been looking at,
I don't know how much that is. I mean,
well,
$50 million or,
your fight, other than bringing another transmission line in, is actually having generation. So then you start to get into a whole nother, and we used to have 2 generation units, 2 diesel powered units. But that's where you start weighing your pros and your cons. If you're paying over $1 million a mile for transmission, you got to bring it 10 miles on top of trying to gain right of way.
Oh, yeah, by the way, that's no small problem. So, you and I bounced around things like battery storage and stuff like that. And I realize it's all more than we can talk about today, but I mean, it seems to me there's a bunch of ways of skinning this cat. You guys know it's better than.
Yeah, and batteries, I think as we all talked about, with the current market conditions, it's not cost effective. B, they are meant for peak shaving, not for long duration. So they don't really help you with islanding. Other things, and many other communities that are at risk for forest fires, tornadoes, have gone to Hawaii. When we moved to Hawaii, have gone to islanding, and they happen to be islands.
What do you mean by islanding?
Where you separate from the grid, or you separate your areas, and so they can run independently. So you put a backup generation in, and you can segregate your community into different utilities, for lack of a better word, so that if you have one of the towns, cities in Hawaii, they're separated by a mountain range, and they're really concerned about the transmission going across. So what they did is actually build generation on both sides, and in case of a tropical storm in the Pacific, they can actually suffer a loss of that line and still keep the majority of the 2 communities operating. And that's called islanding.
And you can do that with a battery, but again, as Tom stated, you deal with, like, we can island one circuit, you got 4 circuits. You can island the circuit that's got, BB or Harbor Healthcare, but then you're going to come to a point where you're not going to have the capacity in the battery because you're not having any generation. So
For a long
Does
term.
BB have its
hurricane
own
event.
generator? Yeah.
But that's, and they have to meet JCR standards and stuff. But diesels are inherently less reliable than power. And during Rita and Harvey, there were multiple cases where hospitals wound up going black So,
Because they had diesel as their backup.
So the library, for example, has a diesel backup system, but it does not power the entire building. It powers segments, critical segments within the building. Two batteries too. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I know you have the solar, it's like 250 kW.
I don't,
Yeah, I don't know
I
the answer to the batteries.
do not believe.
I
they
don't
do
think we
this,
do, because I've never heard anybody talk about the batteries.
Because I've been in the switchgear room. and
Yeah.
They installed it.
I don't,
way
no, I
after.
don't think
So
so.
what can
I
we
think it's
do
just the
about
diesel backup and then the solar helps with the differential cost.
generating more electricity
Well,
within?
I was gonna say, is that something we want to get into, or should we get into? I'm the one to see what our next
Yeah.
charge is. And that's so complicated with everything else that's going on because of the change in usage and, distributed energy by solar and batteries and
Yeah.
windows.
And this new
whatever.
federal legislation, hopefully,
Yeah.
will have a fair amount of money in it for things like that.
So, but I mean,
It hasn't been voted on yet.
we
so-
don't want to ignore, global warming, but on the power side, I'm just looking at you, Austin. I mean, how can we, do you think we should get into that? Is that something we could actually think through and come up with reasonable results from our mitigation standpoint? Because there's so much going on. I don't know how we straighten it all out. And we don't even understand what's happening in the bigger market right now.
I mean, one of the things that we could come to a head at with the committee is provide a recommendation that, we entertain, even though we are doing it, but to do further entertainment within, trying to find redundant feed, looking at backup generation. Could we have batteries that sustained? I mean, when we were looking, it was 10 and 20 megawatt at that point in time, 4 hours. Your loading is surprisingly pretty equal between the winter and the summer. So we peak out. Our coincidence, I mean, obviously we have a decent amount in the summer, but we also are starting to see it in the winter, with the 2 redundant blizzards this past winter, you're getting down to the single digits,
Was that electric heat pumps that's doing that?
electric
Yeah.
pumps.
We've become
Mhm.
much more heat pump driven than fossil fuel driven heat.
I've seen, so I handle all the solar applications, and I've seen people actually convert from LP to either natural gas LP or, and they convert their entire home over to all electric.
In the environmental field, there's a lot of momentum building toward, I mean, there are a lot of cities that are banning natural gas. They're going to all electrification.
State of California.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, it's such a big issue. We could spend a lot of time trying to unravel all the various options that are happening.
But
I'm just concerned we could spend a lot of this committee's time trying to figure it out, and a lot of it is really not related. It's everything else that's happening.
yeah, my recommendation would be is that the other ones are probably more directly applicable.
What do you mean,
Water, wastewater, sewer, and not that electrical isn't, but electrical is still in the birthing phases. And maybe, by the end, but there's so much out there changing right now, specifically with the federal legislation, because that could free up, I mean, it's $370 billion in the environmental portion of it. So that could be.
So I'm fine with that. I mean,
Okay.
I mean, if I heard what you said, there is value in there being some statement, if not resolution, that suggests we need to build more resilience. We need to find a way of preparing for some duration of there not being power coming in from DPNL. And there has to be a scheme for that, but it sounds like you guys are gonna have to figure that out, and it's gonna be a challenging thing. There's plenty to
Yeah.
do here.
Yeah, that's
There's
the
water
bog
and
down with
water
that,
and
'cause it is so-
wastewater and.
Yeah.
and
Where I think it does
stormwater.
overlap is, if the committee does want to tackle something related to the overhead wire undergrounding,
That-
transforming. That aspect should take into account this bigger picture. But otherwise, focusing on these other topics, and then maybe by that point at the end, or down the line, electrical will be more
Clear.
or less cloudy.
But I'm getting the feeling that that's not as impactful as so many other variables that are happening right now. in the electrical area. So let me ask you, Austin, what are you looking for from the committee at this point? Is there anything now we've got this far? Anything that you'd like us to concentrate on going forward?
I think exactly what we've talked about it, because we are getting to the point where we put a significant amount of money in the capital budget to start upgrading pump stations and et cetera. What are we going to do when we do that? So California is one that's on there. Pump station 4, we're going to be doing some work there, putting a generator in. Pump station 3, we're going to be doing some work. As part of that, we discussed getting the wet well out of the road as an option and putting it actually on the Pilot Town Marina side. Well, if we do that, I believe that touches into the flood zone. So then if we're doing that, are we putting the controls in the existing brick building, but that's below grade versus putting them above grade? I already know their sensitivity to the individuals that live out there based off what they can see. So that's kind of, I think, where I see this heading, is that it basically creates a new standard for what we're going to do moving forward.
And timing on it, I mean, if we project that elevation 11 is where we're going, so when do we start implementing that? I mean, you can't put control panel up 11 feet in the air in front of somebody's house today. That's not going to be needed.
Good question, Chris.
So we're going to continue to build new facilities. How do we implement that so it doesn't?
Well, I guess the question though I would have is that whether we really need to raise the control panels to 11 or put them into watertight enclosures.
Right.
I mean, that's an alternative.
Yeah.
I mean, designing to a elevation 11.
Yeah.
Gives you two options.
But maybe it's
Is the technology available for watertight enclosures for that type of equipment? Is that appropriate?
Submarines.
No,
seriously.
As a
Seriously.
26-year Navy veteran, I understand submarines.
No, seriously.
Yeah. No, but I don't know the answer to it, so I'm asking. Are there?
You build a concrete building, you can shed it, face into anything and watertight door. No, that is.
a lot of the panels are just, the pumping station panels we're talking about. I'm sure
And,
you have it built.
actually those you can even get. NEMA.
Okay.
But
So-
and we don't have to be the first ones to kind of design this, because the county has built pump stations that are in the flood zone. DPNL and Delaware Electric Co-op are putting transformers in the flood zone. I'll use, actually, this is one that I did want to show everybody, because I showed Tom and Press, is that we talk about a lot of people discuss the wastewater treatment plant and the location of it, and it's just an anomaly because it sits out in the floodplain. So if you do a little bit of, we went to a conference in Charleston, and one of the options was to actually go visit a wastewater treatment plant. That's Plum Island. That is completely surrounded. I mean, if you look at the road that takes you in,
It says water on roadway.
water on both sides, and it sits out. So we can utilize having others who have gone through this process to help us when we're developing, recommendations for policies or whatever it may be moving forward.
I ask you a question about your pump stations. Would you move to submersible pumps in your stations so that?
So three is one of those that if we rebuilt 3, we would look to move to submersibles.
I think all future pump stations. will be submersible.
I would agree.
I agree too.
And flow meters and
Yes, that's our new standard for any new pump station that's going in. So when we put $500,000 a year for the next 5 years in the budget, So the purpose of that is to go in and whenever we do major renovations, is putting flow meters in wherever we
And
can.
how far would that get you?
$500,000 a year, or
How many pump stations would that?
that's a decent amount. So we just put a bypass. That's the other piece that we're doing. We're putting bypassing in at every one of the pump stations. So we have a failure. We have a bypass pump that we have a Godwin that we can hook up and bypass each pump station. It just adds a little bit of redundancy. But I think most time you budget 50,000 a pump station, you got 27 pump stations. Knowing that some of those pump stations are within 5 years of just coming into service. So you got about 20 pump stations that you really need to hit. So
What about
there's
screens? Most of them, I imagine the smaller ones are grinder pumps, but do you have screens on some of the larger ones, or are they all grinders?
we used to have a screen at pump station 4. That screen was decommissioned, and we're discussing on what we're going to do at the larger pump stations. Right now, most of all of our pumps are grinders.
The screens are a little bit harder to waterproof.
Yeah.
And maintain on, a regular basis. Most of our pump stations are relatively small.
Yeah.
Just 4 and 8 are big ones.
Yeah.
Putting screens in that have to be maintained every day and
Yeah.
cleaned and all that kind of stuff.
But before, with the problem we've had with plugging, that's one of the things that's being looked at right now.
Let's see.
Well, isn't part of the answer to your question that you say this committee decides 11 is the right number? The BPW board decides that 11 is the right number, tells the city council about it. It sort of becomes a fact at some point. And you give Austin direction for that. And
Do we start building to that right away? That's the question.
start building to that, in the near term, or at least planning to build to that in the near term.
Well, doesn't it kind of depend on, each of these items has a lifetime expectancy. Like you said, there's 20 pump stations that I thought I heard you say that kind of need attention.
Yeah, we have first town, best line, first town, the first state. First town, the first state, you have old infrastructure. So
But so every one of these items, I'm assuming has a
Yeah.
sort of lifespan,
each one
which
was,
you can sort of factor into what elevation makes sense, right?
But if we put, say if we upgrade 3.
Mhm.
I think they're on, how is that road? Depending on how much we upgrade, if we rebuild it, then it could last 30 years easily.
Okay, there you go.
Okay.
So you can always replace
Some of-
machinery.
Some
but
of
it's
these
just-
pumping stations are
Gotcha.
that old already.
Is it worth? You guys probably have it in your heads. Is it worth putting the sort of lifespan, sort of the number of years that you can expect each of these classes to work?
I think I have it.
Yeah.
I think I have it in the asset management report. And I can pass that out to everybody. It's very large. So I may have sent in the link. Because it goes down, it has an asset registry for everything on the water and wastewater side.
The other way of skinning this cat is going at it from the lowest elevations and working up, right? Using a geographic ranking scheme, basically.
But you're gonna need a mix, because he's gonna have machinery that's needs it,
Right. No, I'm saying in terms of getting at the longer term, rising sea, rising water problem, you can also look at the areas that are going to get into water sooner than others.
Simple things. Should we be installing meters higher on the wall, or doing something with water meters today? Start installing the next pad mounted transformers like we talked about. Should they be another couple of feet higher when we put them in? Because it lasts 30 years. So most of the stuff probably can last 30 years.
That's an interesting point. So things like the meters, are they subject to the first floor elevation kind of
The
Standard-
problem with that with talking or Brett is it's the working on them and getting to them.
You talking on the electric side?
Yeah. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, yeah.
It's, if you got a
Yeah.
out by box that's 10 foot in the air.
Yeah.
But-
Then you don't want the guys working on it from a ladder. It's a safety
Right.
issue.
But correct me. I mean, first floor has been interpreted to mean auxiliary equipment, like your air conditioners have to be mounted and heat pumps have to be mounted.
Yeah.
At that,
All your ductwork and everything has to
so-
be above that. Yeah.
and, your electrical system has to be above that.
The internal, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I guess I was assuming that because of that the meter had to be also.
FEMA's usually kind of on deals, don't deal with that, outside. Of course, they say, yes, it's great
That gets back
to
to
have it, but
the transformer, I meant a transformer.
yeah.
Well,
There's
but that's
nothing-
clearly our infrastructure.
Yeah.
I guess I was surprised
At the
knowing
house.
the building code that you can't put you can't put your circuit breaker box down there,
You can't put your
but,
meter-
but you can put your meter down.
Yeah.
It's the electrical equivalent of the lateral between the right of way, clean out and the house.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
It's
was
similar.
kind of.
Yeah.
new- It's news to me because
Yeah.
it's counterintuitive
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
your breaker panel has to be, but you
Yeah.
can put your meter below water.
On the, looking at what we're moving to in the future on the water plant itself.
Mhm.
We talked about at the houses and everything, but what about the impacts back at the water treatment plant with the possibility that if water is up 5 feet, we're definitely going to have a different kind of source, water source. And I mean, are we going to look at any of that or have GMP look at any of that?
I think our
Might
wells,
be required modifications to wells.
You're talking about groundwater, like saltwater intrusion?
Yes.
So we, as part of our well allocation permit that we just renewed, we have to do a saltwater intrusion plan, which start to hit on this is that once you start noticing salt water, these are the steps you're gonna take. You put monitoring wells in. Just pulling this up. Yeah, so plants down here, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
It's not actually surface water,
Yeah, it's your water
run over everything that you're worried about, but what's going on underneath. I know if I recall, you're taking from a deeper zone with a clay lens, and then the upper aquifer is going to be the one probably more impacted by the saline water. So you may be okay in effect because you're taking it from the deeper the Columbia.
We are, and I don't know where we are, talking about putting in a monitoring well
Mhm.
to be able to.
That's
from the
right,
Ebenezer
because of that
branch.
development that's coming
Yeah.
in.
Well, that's on the
That's
other side of the
another one.
road,
Oh.
but we're talking about putting one in to monitor the Ebenezer branch.
Oh, good.
Did this
For
come from,
exactly that reason.
this came from Andrus and his worries?
No, this was, well, the salt, you mean having the,
The Delaware Geological Survey spoke to you guys like,
oh yeah,
in the spring of
21.
21, yeah. And he said, if all the things I worry about it coming up there behind the well field. And I'm
Yeah.
assuming he was talking about Ebenezer Branch.
Well, yeah, I mean, even when we discussed it with Denrec, when we were talking about an additional well over on New Road, their biggest concern was Canary Creek and the influence that both Ebenezer and Canary Creek played into the water table out there.
I just suspect that when it gets to that point, we're gonna have to treat it. I mean, because we're concerned about other things getting into the groundwater from all the development and everything around it.
Mhm.
I just think, the well location is difficult. So,
Both you and Darren have always described this well as being the perfectly placed well. It's gonna be very hard, if not impossible, to replicate somewhere else.
Oh, yeah, you can't, it is, if you look at a map, and I wish I had it, it's a heat map, you could not have picked a better place for all 5 wells. It's like the Mecca.
So we will wind up with 3 monitoring wells. One close to the Ebenezer branch and 2 on the Mitchell Farm development. And you know, the rest of the land is yet to be heard. But, you know, I think we're very clear that they said that Mitchell Farm was not setting the precedent. It's laying the groundwork.
Yeah, I was just curious if there is, that's being looked into and currently you guys are already on top of that part of.
Well, what would a treatment plant cost you?
Desalinization
Desalinization.
gets expensive, but I mean,
And where would you
it's,
put it?
that's it. You're trying to find a location you can put it.
You may find that drilling wells further away from the salt may be cheaper,
Again, finding a site to do it.
right? I
It's
mean,
work.
it'd be quite a
Without-
ways,
without
especially if you got
development.
11 feet of water underground.
Yeah, I mean, because your recharge zone, it's gonna be underdeveloped area probably. You can't find big enough open areas that you put wells in that of good quality and production. And I think we're probably going to be stuck trying to take care of it on our site, but as long as we can get decent water out of the wells. Even still.
Or
We-
or
we've been-
biting the
we've been
bullet
look-
and going with Tidewater.
We,
We already have the interconnection
well,
there for.
Tidewater's wells are.
Yes,
not-
I know.
Yeah.
They're just up the road.
Yeah.
So, you know, and we've spent a lot of time looking for additional places to put wells. And have not come up with anything that is,
You know,
It's not
I'm thinking
unreasonable.
it may be worthwhile to have that study done. If the water as shown on that map is happening, what is happening to your wells? I mean, that can be done on computers and to see, you know, if you're drawing 700,000 gallons a day of water out of the ground and you got these kinds of
Well,
geotechs.
it should be part of the wellhead study. Aren't you guys a well
I
study? going on right now?
say, you know, we are doing a wellhead protection area, or we've authorized DENREC to do a wellhead protection study.
And does it
We're paying
include
for
this, does it include the possibility of this saltwater intrusion if it were to happen?
I don't know if they're taking that into consideration.
Well, I mean, because it's the Ebenezer branch. That's a good question. I don't know.
Maybe we could get some information from them out of this study if we pushed it a little bit.
Yeah.
Like that, because, you know, we went to DENREC and, you know, we wanted them to do the study because of all the development. And they said, well, we'll give you $7,000 and you pay for the rest of it.
All right.
And
That'll
we
take care
felt
of the
it was
gas tank on the way
important
home.
we felt it was necessary and worthwhile that we are funding the remaining $70,000. But it's still, what did they say, a year and a half?
They told us 2 years.
That's DGS to north.
Yeah. Denrick and DGS.
So,
Okay, well, I just wondered.
That's a good point. It may be more expensive, but given that you've got the guys with the computer model, that's the time to figure it out. And they've got the guys in-house to do that.
yeah, we should probably go back and query whether,
I already did. Still waiting on a
Step
response.
Well,
Yeah.
what's our next step, do you think? Where do we? I think we've gotten as far as we can get consolidation with the help of JHD's information. We should be able to clean it up beginning of next meeting. But we can look at each of the utilities and discuss, be more specific about the impacts on the utilities in each assessment.
I think Robin and I can go back and start looking at, the lift stations that are more vulnerable. And kind of come back with a list of which ones we feel are gonna be, it's like you said, if you're looking at this map, it's out of date anyway, so.
Yeah, but I think, shouldn't most of that be on the beach side? I mean, isn't that where we should be? That's where most of our impacts are gonna take place.
You're close. Which one is this?
This is the 2-foot.
And the other is,
Yeah,
I
so
keep thinking about the beach side, but there's other. areas
Right,
that you cleared
there's,
out
there's,
earlier.
there's this area, there's up in here in Canary Creek,
Yeah, there's a couple.
and right, it's just basically an elevation thing, right?
Yeah.
You just start at the bottom and start looking
But it
upwards.
seems to me, I mean, with pumping stations, it's gonna be the same thing. We're gonna have to make this watertight, waterproof, and resistant as possible, and have the control equipment at an elevation to be really safe. So Isn't the
Or-
same, isn't
Or
the same,
mitigate it, yeah, or block.
but isn't that the same thing for basically all the pumping stations that feel the impact of it? We're not gonna get into the nuts and bolts design of it, I don't think.
No, I would think,
No, I'm
it's,
not
you know, that
qualified
you
to
need to,
Yeah, I mean,
I think it's more, the group to determine the elevation and the risks, and then leave it to the engineering
that's,
to either determine whether elevation or watertight enclosure or
Combination.
something else is the most cost-effective, aesthetically appropriate for the area.
So many of these things, it's, you know, I think the important challenge for all of this is that, you know, we look at this sea level rise, this is like a picture of the sea level. But of course, the sea is very dynamic, right? It goes up and down every day, several times a day. And every storm changes the height and so on. So it's this very dynamic process. It's like the stock market, right? It's doing this. And so then it becomes a matter of the thresholds, right? When do you have to worry about this? When do you have to worry about that? Right? How often can you afford to have something down because it's wet? You know, what are the, I mean, that's the way I've been looking at this for a while. I don't know if that's the right way to do it. But I guess I'm just saying all this because we need to keep in mind that for whatever sea level scenario you put, you know, whatever year you put, there's at least 2 feet of additional water that's periodically going to pop on top of that sea level. You know, there's a whole curve that can be developed as to the probability of when you have, you know,
Well, you know, in
water
addition,
reaching this elevation on top of the sea level.
in addition to the asset management, one of the things I was hoping the committee would come up with is a mitigation plan, a disaster preparedness plan, so that when do we shut electricity off to
Right.
various areas?
Right.
When do we isolate areas, pump stations? Do we need to do something in addition to that, like putting in inflatable blocks in pipes in advance of a storm? Those type of things which are not necessarily changing the way we're building, but are the reactive, preemptive effects. And
Kind of like have KBC's aboard ship, get the ship ready.
yes,
What are the inflatable things you just talked about? They go in like water pipes?
well, to sewer or stormwater pipes.
Okay.
You know, that, you know, if you wanted to prevent backflow.
You're talking about
along those
plugs.
lines. What's it?
Inflatable
Inflatable
plugs,
plugs,
yeah.
yeah.
But you brought up another interesting one. If for some reason power went out, I guess you've got a backup generation system for water. You've got pressure coming from the tanks.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, the pressure in the town is set by the tank, and we can feed from the wells, and
Yeah, you
there are
can switch the pressure.
3 generators,
Two.
2.
One does the plant and 2 wells, the other one does the other 3 wells.
However, we need to look at those generators from a risk perspective.
And so Tom, that was kind of where I was headed with what I was saying is there's going to be other things that don't fit neatly in the, you know, forecast of this decade. It's going to see that decade, the sea is going to be at that level. You know, we've already gotten close to the 100-year floodplain once in the, in a couple different storms, one or two times in the last, in our lifetimes. That as the sea level rises, all those peak storm situations go up too, right?
Right.
But isn't that what the
Yeah, that's what
2050 projection is all about? I mean, it's gonna be, it's probably not very conservative going forward with it.
we're right.
Yes,
So
till now.
I bring it up just to say, I maybe I misunderstood. We have this elevation, and I took it to mean, okay, so we're gonna keep this thinking about the plant, but yeah, that elevation as well as a series of lower elevations, working back from 2050 to now, are going to be a factor for all the rest of the infrastructure that's on the map here.
Well, but see, I'm not sure that the 2050 flood stage that we've chosen, it does not consider a Cat 3 hurricane being the driver.
Right.
It's sea level rise, it's static with fluctuations.
I don't know, the floodplain, the flood analysis, the FEMA flood studies are based on those big storms.
They're still not based upon overtopping of the dune structures. And so, there's a caveat.
Well,
Yes.
let me,
Yeah,
we've
just-
been here a while.
Yeah, just the flip that is that if you're inland, these numbers are much more solid. If you're coastal, they specifically, the assumption is that the dune structure is what the dune structure is, and it doesn't get breached. So just leaving it at that, because a last piece of uncertainty there.
I think there's an opportunity for the city, it may not be a DPW thing, to be examining just how to protect those dunes. I think that's a whole
Is that the
whole
city?
thing that, well, that's
Benrick and
I-
the Corps and everybody
well,
else.
Yeah.
It goes beyond the city because the city,
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
there's federal government and state players in that question. Yeah. Because
All right.
anytime you start monkeying with the dunes, you get into that pretty quick, yeah.
Because the city doesn't pay for the dune replenishment. And they cannot afford to.
I can equivocally say yes to that. So I'm on the finance committee, and so I do deep dives into the finances, and I have done for years. And so, there's only a $5 million reserve at this point in time, and that's insubstantial when you compare it to whatever might arise in terms of capital requirements as well as emergency requirements. It's just not. So, and very few of the population appreciate how that won't go very far.
So I guess the only reason I brought this up is at some point, I hope that we all realize the challenge of using beach nourishment is the only way of protecting that dune. We're gonna have to get a little more creative.
And then, the Army Corps of Engineers, in terms of beach replenishment or restoration, one of the things that I'm looking at on behalf of the city council is a parking study. Why I volunteered for this. I must have been fatigued and not enough
Didn't
caffeine.
they ever tell you not to volunteer?
Yeah, I should have learned that in the Navy, but.
Remember that point I made about electric bikes earlier?
Yeah, okay. So separate from that, but one point I'd just like to make, according to the Army Corps of Engineers regulations, if you restrict parking along the beach, they will not replenish your beaches. So, if for that question to be asked and answered, there needs to be some awareness that, the lifeblood of the area could be deleteriously affected should that it's off message and off topic here, but it's just kind of a part of the bigger question of beaches, dunes, and infrastructure.
It's all connected.
Okay, we'll pick this up after at the next meeting. And if we get GHD's information about pipes and so forth. But maybe the topic we should head towards, like you brought it up, is disaster response plan. So can we kind of talk about it over the next week or two and see what we need to do to get that started, set up?
Yeah, probably.
Is there any other topic you guys, anybody else?
Yeah, the topic we do need to talk about it internally relative to this one trip to Tulsa.
Yeah, well, that's, yeah.
Well,
We'll know
there's
more
two ways
tomorrow.
to address it. One is assume you're 11-foot terrible flood, and what could you leave, what would you still have? And what, and how would you keep the odds?
How would we recover?
And then what?
All right.
Well, BB's at like 15 or 16. They're on the mountain.
Yeah.
I'm at 13 feet. Anyone want to come over for dinner? Yeah, we have a gas stove, so.
All right.
Bring your own toilet.
What would you leave on? What would you have to turn off? What could you not?
I'll be out of town. Can I zoom in? Gone for a month or so, but- So I'm saying, I'm not gonna be here for the next meeting, but I'm happy to zoom in.
Where are you going in a lunch taking?
I'm going to the Rangeley Lakes area in Maine. Western Maine. Hope it'll be cooler. It's not always cool, but hopefully it'll be cooler.
It's cooler in Florida when I was in there.
We've been talking about Wednesday mornings at 9:30 going forward. What's the pleasure? I can't do the 24th. I guess I could. I can do it in the morning.
That's the BPW meeting. I think that's gonna, I would suggest we stay away from the 24th.
Okay. 31st, but I have a children's beach house meeting that morning, so I can't do that. Is September too far out? Or do you want a different day than Wednesday? 7th of September.
Well, hold on, the children's beach house meeting is from when to when?
So it's same time. It's 10:30, 10 o'clock.
Does anyone have a problem with
What day?
Wednesday, the 31st of August?
I'm good.
We can do it at 11, but that goes to lunch hour. We'll run through the lunch hour. If we do that, we can do it like 1. We'll move it to the next week.
Okay, either way.
I'm easy as long as you guys,
So it's,
okay, as long as I can zoom in.
if 1 o'clock's okay, let's put it at 1 o'clock,
31st.
31st.
So there might have been me, but I had some problems fitting into that. I did like the webinar. It just said the webinar was expired. So.
Oh,
It was?
Thank you for raising it.
yeah.
Yes.
Sharon on?
Yeah, she was on. It might have been just me. I'm just letting.
No, it's good, because we,
Yeah, next time call,
Okay.
check it. I'm sure somebody will be.
Mhm.
here to answer that.
Yeah, I planned on being here. It was just I was getting my car repaired. It was just like a quick. I was like, oh, let me get on the Zoom, and it said webinar expired. So
Sorry.
that's okay. Thank you, I
technology is a
appreciate that.
wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Are you doing a good job?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. Do you have any questions?
Not really. I'm really just learning as much. So that's I definitely Sharon.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to get up with her for the first part of the meeting. But yeah, I'm just learning. This is a learning thing for me. I do think I'm gonna have an article on it, but that's pretty much just. May have some questions that I could send over, but I'm trying to absorb it as much as possible.
Well, we're learning also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's new territory for everyone.
Yes, yeah, I mean, I appreciate taking it on too, because it's not an easy task either.
You know, and living in Delaware, you're not isolated.
Yeah. I've lived in Delaware my whole life, so it's
I mean, it's my job. Oh yeah, it's my job, but I've also been well aware of like, hey, this is